Jamaica Inn 1. It was a cold, gray day in late November. The weather had changed overnight when a backing wind brought a granite sky and a mizzling rain with it, and although it was now only a little after 2 o'clock in the afternoon, the pallor of winter evening seemed to have closed upon the hills, cloaking them in mist. It would be dark by 4. The air was clammy cold, and for all the tightly closed windows it penetrated the interior of the coach. The leather seats felt damp to the hands, and there must have been a small crack in the roof, because now, and again little drips of rain fell softly through, smudging the leather and leaving a dark blue stain like a splodge of ink. The wind came in gusts, at times shaking the coach as it travelled round the bend of the road, and in the exposed places on the higher ground it blew with such force that the whole body of the coach trembled and swayed, rocking between the high wheels and the drunken man, like a drunken man. The driver, muffled in a great coat to his ears, bent almost double in his seat in a faint endeavor to gain shelter from his own shoulders, while the dispirited horses plodded sullenly to his command, too broken by the wind and the rain to feel the whip that now and again cracked above their heads, while it swung between the numb fingers of the driver. The wheels of the coach creaked and groaned as they sank into the ruts of the road, and sometimes they flung the soft spattered mud against the windows where it mingled with the constant driving rain, and whatever view there might have been of the countryside was hopelessly obscured. A few passengers huddled together for warmth, exclaiming in unison when the coach sank into a heavier rut than usual, and one old fellow, who had kept up a constant complaint ever since he had joined the coach at Truro, rose from his seat in a fury, and fumbling with the window sash, let the window down with a crash, bringing a shower of rain in upon himself and his fellow passengers. He thrust his hand out, shouted up to the driver, cursing him in a high, petulant voice for a rogue and a murderer, that they would all be dead before they reached Bodmin if he persisted in driving at breakneck speed. They had no breath left in their bodies as it was, and he, for one, would never travel by coach again. Whether the driver heard him or not was uncertain. It seemed more likely that the stream of reproaches was carried away in the wind, and for the old fellow, after waiting a moment, put up the window again, having thoroughly chilled the interior of the coach, and settling himself once more in his corner, wrapped his blanket around his knees, and muttered in his beard. His nearest neighbor, a jovial, red-faced woman in a blue cloak, sighed heavily in sympathy, and with a wink to anyone who might be looking and a jerk of her head towards the old man, she remarked for at least the 20th time that it was the dirtiest night she ever remembered, and she had known some that it was proper old weather, and no mistaking it for summer this time, and burrowing into the depths of a large basket, she brought out a great hunk of cake and plunged into it with her strong white teeth. Mary Yellen sat in the opposite corner, where the trickle of rain oozed through the crack of the roof. Sometimes a cold drip of moisture fell upon her shoulder, which she brushed away with impatient fingers. She sat with her chin cupped in her hands, her eyes fixed on the window and splashed with mud and rain, hoping with a sort of desperate interest that some ray of light would break the heavy blanket of sky. But a momentary trace of that lost blue heaven that had mantled Helford yesterday shone for an instant as a forerunner of fortune. Already, though barely 40 miles by road from what had been her home for 3 and 20 years, the hope within her heart had tired, and that rather gallant courage which was so large a part of her, and had stood her in such stead during the long agony of her mother's illness and death, was now shaken by the first fall of rain and the nagging wind. The country was alien to her, which was defeat in itself. As she peered through the misty window of the coach, she looked out upon the different world from the one she had known only a day's journey back. How remote now, and hidden perhaps forever, were the shining waters of Helford, the green hills and the sloping valleys, the white cluster of cottages at the water's edge. It was a gentle rain that fell at Helford, a rain that pattered in the many trees and lost itself in the lush grass, formed into brooks and rivulets that emptied into the broad river, sank into the graceful soil, which gave back flowers in payment. This was a lashing, pitiless rain that stung the windows of the coach, and it soaked into a hard, barren soil. No trees here, save one or two that stretched bare branches to the four winds, bent and twisted from centuries of storm. So black were they by time and tempest that even if spring did breathe on such a place, no buds would dare to come leaf for fear the late frost should kill them. It was a scrubby land, without hedgerow or meadow, a country of stones, black heather, and stunted broom. There would never be a gentle season here, thought Mary, either grim winter, as it was today, or else the dry and parching heat of midsummer, which never a valley to give shade or shelter, but grass that turned yellow-brown before May was past. The country had gone gray with the weather. Even the people on the road and in the villages changed in harmony with their background. At Helston, where she had taken the first coach, she had trodden familiar ground. So many childish memories clung about Helston, the weekly drive to the market with her father in the vanished days, and when he was taken from them, the fortitude with which her mother held his place, driving backwards and forwards, winter and summer, as he had done, with her hens and her eggs and her butter in the back of the cart, while Mary sat at her side, clutching at a basket as big as herself, her small chin resting on the handle. Folk were friendly in Helston. The name of Yellen was known and respected in the town, for the widow had a hard fight against life when her husband died. There were not many women who would have lived alone as she did, with one child and a farm to tend, with never a thought of taking another man. There was a farmer at Monacan who would have asked her had he dared, and another up the river at Gweek, but they could tell from her eyes she would have neither of them, but belonged in body and mind to the man who had gone. It was the hard work of the farm that told her in the end, for she would not spare herself, and though she was driven and flogged her energy for 17 years of her widowhood, she could not stand up to the strain when the last test came and her heart went from her. Little by little her stock had decreased, and with the times being so bad, so she was told in Helston, and prices fallen to nothing, there was no money anywhere. Up country it was the same. There would be starvation in the farms before long. Then sickness attacked the ground and killed the livestock in the villages around Helford. There was no name to it, and no cure could be discovered. It was a sickness that came over everything and destroyed, much as late frost will out of season, coming with the new moon and then departing, leaving no trace of its passage save the little trail of dead things in its path. It was an anxious, weary time for Mary Yellen and her mother. One by one they saw their chickens and the ducklings that had reared sicken and die, and the young calf fell into the meadow where he stood. The most pitiful was the old mare who had served them 20 years, and upon whose broad and sturdy back Mary had first straddled her young legs. She died in the stall one morning, her faithful head in Mary's lap, when a pit was dug for her under the apple trees in the orchard, and she was buried. They knew she would no longer carry them to Helston market day. Mary's mother turned to her and said, "There's something of me gone in the grave with poor Nell, Mary. I don't know whether it's my faith or what it is, but my heart feels tired and I can't go on any more." She went into the house and sat down in the kitchen, pale as a sheet, and 10 years beyond her age. She shrugged her shoulders when Mary said she would fetch the doctor. "It's too late, child," she said. 17 years too late, and she began to cry softly, who had never cried before. Mary fetched the old doctor who lived in Malgan, and who had brought her into the world, and as he drove her back in his trap, he shook his head at her. "I tell you what it is, Mary," he said. "Your mother has spared neither her mind nor her body since your father died, and she has broken down at last. I don't like it. It's come at a bad time." They drove along the twisting lane to the farmhouse at the top of the village. A neighbor met them at the gate, her face eager to impart bad news. "Your mother's worse," she cried. "She came out of the door just now, staring like a ghost, and she trembled all over, and fell down in the path. Miss Hoblin has gone to her, and Will Cyril, and they've lifted her inside, poor soul. They say her eyes are shut." Firmly, the doctor pushed the little gaping crowd away from the door. Together, he and the man, Cyril, lifted the still figure from the floor and carried her upstairs to the bedroom. "It's a stroke," said the doctor, "but she's breathing. Her pulse is steady. This is what I've been afraid of, that she'd snap suddenly like this. Why it's come just now after all these years is known only to the Lord and herself. You must prove yourself's parent's child now, Mary, and help her through this. You are the only one who can." For 6 long months or more, Mary nursed her mother in this her first and last illness, but with all the care she and the doctor gave her, it was not the widow's will to recover. She had no wish to fight for her life. It was as though she longed for release, and prayed silently that it would come quickly. She said to Mary, "I don't want you to struggle as I have done. It is a breaking of the body and of the spirit. There's no call for you to stay on Helford after I'm gone. It's best for you to go to your Aunt Patience out to Baldman. There was no use in Mary telling her mother that she would not die. It was fixed there in her mind, and there was no fighting it. I haven't any wish to leave the farm, mother, she said. I was born here, and my father before me, and you are a Helford woman. This is where the Yellens belong to be. I'm not afraid of being poor, and the farm falling away. You worked here for 17 years alone, so why shouldn't I do the same? I'm strong. I can do the work of a man. You know that. It's no life for a girl, said her mother. I did it all these years because of your father, and because of you. Working for someone keeps a woman calm and contented, but it's another thing when you work for yourself. There's no heart in it then. I'd be no use in a town, said Mary. I've never known anything in this life by the river, and I don't want to. Going into Helston is town enough for me. I'm best here with the few chickens that's left to us, and the green stuff of the garden, the old pig, and a bit of boat on the river. What would I do up to Bodmin with my Aunt Patience? A girl can't live alone, Mary, without she goes queer in the head and comes to evil. It's either one or the other. Have you forgotten poor Sue, who walked to the churchyard at midnight with the full moon and called upon the lover she never had? There was one maid before you were born, left an orphan at 16. She ran away to Falmouth and went with the sailors. I'd not rest in my grave, nor your father neither, if we didn't leave you safe. You'll like your Aunt Patience. She was always a great one for games and laughing, with a heart as large as life. You remember when she came here 12 years back? She had ribbons in her bonnet and a silk petticoat. There was a fellow working at the Trelawarren who had an eye to her, but she thought herself too good for him. Yes, Mary remembered Aunt Patience, with her curled fringe and large blue eyes, and how she laughed and chatted, and how she picked up her skirts and tiptoed through the mud in the yard. She was as pretty as a fairy. What sort of man your Uncle Joshua is, I cannot say, said her mother, for I never set eyes on him, nor known anyone that has. But when your aunt married him 10 years ago, last Michaelmas, she wrote a pack of giddy nonsense you'd expect a girl to write, and not a woman over 30. They think me rough, said Mary slowly. I haven't the pretty manners they'd expect. We wouldn't have much to say to one another. They'll love you for yourself and not any airs and graces. I want you to promise me this, child, that when I'm gone, you'll write to your Aunt Patience and tell her that it was my last and dearest wish that you should go to her. I promise, said Mary, but her heart was heavy and distressed at the thought of the future, so insecure and changed, and with all that she had known and loved gone from her, and not even the comfort of familiar trodden ground to help her through the bad days when they came. Daily her mother weakened. Daily the life ebbed from her. She lingered through the harvest time and through the fruit picking and through the first falling of the leaves. But when the mist came in the morning and the frost settled on the ground, and the swollen river ran in flood to meet the boisterous sea, and the waves thundered and broke on the little beaches of Helford, the widow turned restlessly in her bed, plucking at the sheets. She called Mary by her dead husband's name and spoke of things that were gone, and of people Mary had never known. For 3 days she lived in a little world of her own, and on the fourth day she died. One by one Mary saw the things she had loved and understood pass into her hands. The livestock went to Helston Market. The furniture was brought by neighbors. Stick by stick, a man from Coverack took a fancy to the house and purchased it, with pipe in mouth, and styled the yard and pointed out the changes he would make, the trees he would cut down to clear his view, while Mary watched him in dumb loathing from her window as she packed her small belongings in her father's trunk. This stranger from Coverack made her an interloper in her own home, and she could see from his eye he wanted to be gone, and she had no other thought now but to be away and out of it all, and her back turned forever. Once more she read the letter from her aunt, written in a cramped hand on plain paper. The writer said she was shocked by the blow that had befallen her niece, that she had no idea her sister was ill. It was so many years now since she had been to Helford, and she went on, There have been changes with us you would not know. I no longer live in Bodmin, but nearly 12 miles outside, on the road to Launceston. It's a wild and lovely spot, but if you were to come to us, I should be glad of your company winter time. I have asked your uncle, and he does not object. He says, if you are quiet-spoken and not a talker, and will give help when needed, he cannot give you money or feed you for nothing, as you will understand. He will expect you to help in the bar, in return for your board and lodging. You see, your uncle is the landlord of Jamaica Inn. Mary folded the letter and put it in her trunk. It was a strange message of welcome from the smiling Aunt Patience she remembered, a cold, empty letter giving no word of comfort, and admitting nothing except that her niece must not ask for money. Aunt Patience, with her silk petticoat and delicate ways, the wife of an innkeeper? Mary decided this was something her mother had not known. The letter was very different from the one penned by a happy bride 10 years ago. However, Mary had promised, and there was no returning on her word. Her home was sold. There was no place for her here. Whatever her welcome would be, her aunt was her own mother's sister, and that was one thing to remember. The old life lay behind, the dear familiar farm with the shining Helford waters. Before her lay the future, and Jamaica Inn. And so it was that Mary Ellen found herself northward bound from Helston in the creaking, swaying coach, through Truro town, at the head of the fell, with its many roofs and spires, its broad cobbled streets, the blue sky overhead still speaking of the south, the people at the door smiling and waving as the coach rattled past. But when Truro lay behind in the valley, the sky became overcast, and the country on either side of the high road grew rough and untilled. Villagers were scattered now, and there were a few smiling faces at the cottage doors. Trees were sparse, hedges were now none. Then the wind blew, the rain came with the wind, and so the coach rumbled into Boven, grey and forbidding like the hills that cradled it, and one by one the passengers gathered up their things in preparation for departure. All save Mary, who sat still in her corner. The driver, his face a steam of rain, looked at the window. "Are you going to let Launceston?" he said. "It'll be a wild drive tonight across the moors. You can stay in Bodmin, you know, and go on by coach in the morning. There'll be none of this coach going on but you." "My friends will be expecting me," said Mary. "I'm not afraid of the drive, and I don't want to go as far as Launceston. Will you please put me down at Jamaica Inn?" The man looked at her curiously. "Jamaica Inn?" he said. "What would you be doing at Jamaica Inn? That's no place for a girl. You must have made a mistake, surely." He stared at her hard, not believing her. "Oh, I've heard it's lonely enough," said Mary, "but I don't belong to a town anyway. It's quiet on the Helford River, winter and summer where I come from, and I never felt lonely there." "I never said nothing about loneliness," answered the man. "Maybe you don't understand, being a stranger up here. It's not the 20-odd mile of moor I'm thinking of, though that'd scare most women. Here, wait a minute." He called over his shoulder to a woman who stood in the doorway of the Royal, lighting the lamp above the porch, for it was already dusk. "Missus," he said, "come here and reason with this young girl who's told she for Launceston, but she'd asked me to put her down at Jamaica." The woman came down the steps and peered into the coach. "It's a wild, rough place up there," she said, "and if it's work you're looking for, you won't find it on the farms. They don't like strangers on the moors. You'd do better down here in Bodmin." Mary smiled at her. "I shall be all right," she said. "I'm going to relatives. My uncle is landlord of Jamaica Inn." There was a long silence. In the grey light of the coach, Mary could see that the woman and the man were staring at her. She felt chilled suddenly, anxious, and she wanted some word of reassurance from the woman, but it did not come. Then the woman drew back from the window. "I'm sorry," she said slowly. "It's none of my business, of course. Good night." The driver began to whistle, rather red in the face, as one who wishes to rid himself of an awkward situation. Mary leaned forward impulsively and touched his arm. "Would you tell me?" she said. "I shan't mind what you say. Is my uncle not liked? Is something the matter?" The man looked very uncomfortable. He spoke gruffly and avoided her eyes. "Jamaica's got a bad name," he said. "Queer tales get about. You know how it is, but I don't want to make any trouble. Maybe they're not true." "What sort of tales?" asked Mary. "Do you mean there's much drunkenness there? Does my uncle encourage bad company?" The man would not commit himself. "I don't want to make trouble," he repeated, "and I don't know anything. It's only what people say. Respectable folk don't go to Jamaica anymore. That's all I know. In the old days we used to water the horses there and feed them and go in for a bit of bite and drink. But we don't stop there anymore. We whip the horses past and wait for nothing, not till we get to 5 lanes, and then we don't bide long." "Why don't folk go there? What is their reason?" Mary persisted. The man hesitated. It was as though he were searching for words. "They're afraid," he said at last, and then he shook his head. He would say no more. Perhaps he felt he had been churlish, and was sorry for her, for a moment later he looked in at the window again and spoke to her. "Will you not take a cup of tea here before we go?" he said. "It's a long drive before you, and it's cold on the moors." Mary shook her head. Desire for food had left her, and though the tea would have warmed her, she did not wish to descend from the coach and walk into the Royal, where the woman would have stared at her, and people would murmur. Besides, there was a little nagging coward in her that whispered, "Stay in Bodmin, stay in Bodmin," and for all she knew she might have given way to it in the shelter of the Royal. She had promised her mother to go to Aunt Patience, and there must be no going back on her given word. "We'd best be going then," said the driver. "You are the only traveller on the road tonight. Here's another rug for your knees. I'll whip the horses on when we've climbed the hill out of Boatman, or it's no night on the road. I shan't be easy of my mind until I reach my bed in Launceston. There's not many like us to cross the moors in winter time, not when the weather's dirty." He slammed the door and climbed to a seat. The coach rumbled away down the street, past the safe and solid houses, the busy winking lights, the scattered people hurrying home for supper, their figures bowed against the wind and rain. Through the shuttered windows Mary could see chinks of friendly candlelight. There would be a fire within the gate, and a cloth spread on the table, a woman and children sitting down to their meal while the man warmed his hands before the cheerful blaze. She thought of the smiling countrywoman who had been her fellow passenger. She wondered if she was now sitting at her own table with her children by her side. How comfortable she had been with her apples cheeks, her rough-worn hands. What a world of security in her deep voice. And Mary made a little story of herself, how she might have followed her from the coach and prayed her company, and asked her for a home. Nor would she have refused. She was certain of that. There would have been a smile for her, a friendly hand, and a bed for her. She would have served the woman and grown to love her, shared something of her life, and became acquainted with her people. Now the horses were climbing the steep hill out of the town, and looking through the window at the back of the coach, Mary could see the lights above them fast disappearing one by one until the last glimmer winked and flickered and was gone. She was alone now in the wind and the rain, and 12 long miles of barren moor between her and her destination. She wondered if this was how a ship felt when the security of the harbor was left behind. No vessel could feel more desolate than she did, not even if the wind thundered in the rigging and the sea licked their decks. It was dark in the coach now, for the torch gave forth a sickly yellow glare, and the draught from the crack of the roof sent the flames wandering hither and thither to the danger of the weather, and Mary thought it best to extinguish it. She sat huddled in her corner, swaying from side to side as the coach was shaken, and it seemed to her that never before had she known there was a malevolence in solitude. The very coach, which all the day had rocked her like a cradle, now held a note of menace with its creak and groans. The wind tore at the roof, and the showers of rain, increasing in violence, and now there was no shelter for the hills, spat against the windows with new venom. On either side of the road, the country stretched interminably into space. No trees, no lanes, no cluster of cottages or hamlet, but mile upon mile of bleak moorland, dark and untraversed, rolling like a desert land to some unseen horizon. No human being could live in this wasted country, thought Mary, and remain like other people. The very children would be born twisted, like the blackened shrubs of broom, bent by the force of wind that never ceased, blow as it would from the east and west, from north and south. Their minds would be twisted too, their thoughts evil, dwelling as they must amid marshland of granite, harsh heather, and crumbling stone. They would be born of strange stock, who slept with this earth as a pillow, beneath this black sky. They would have something from the devil left in them still. On wound the road, across the dark and silent land, with never a light to waver for an instant as a message of hope to the traveller within the coach. Perhaps there was no habitation in all the long 21 miles that stretched between the two towns of Bowman and Launceston. Perhaps there was not even a poor shepherd's hut on the desolate highway, nothing but one grim landmark that was Jamaica Inn. Many lost count of time space. The miles might have been 100, and the hour midnight for all she knew. She began to cling to the safety of the coach. At least it had some remnant of familiarity. She had known it since early morning, but there was long ago. However great a nightmare, this was eternal drive. There were at least the 4 close walls to protect her, the shabby leaking roof, and within calling distance the comfortable presence of the driver. At last it seemed to her that he was driving his horses to an even greater speed. She heard him shout to them, the cry of his voice blown past her window on the wind. She lifted the sash and looked out. She was met with a blast of wind and rain that blinded her for the moment, and then shaking clear her hair and pushing it from her eyes, she saw that the coach was topping the breast of a hill at a furious gallop, while on either side of the road was rough moorland, looming ink-black in the mist and rain. Ahead of her on the crest, and to the left, was some sort of building standing back from the road. She could see all tall chimneys, murky dim in the darkness. There was no other house, no other cottage. If this was Jamaica, it stood alone in glory, foursquare to the winds. Mary gathered her cloak around her and fastened the clasps. The horses had been pulled to a standstill and stood sweating under the rain, the steam coming from them in a cloud. The driver climbed down from his seat, pulling the box down with him. He seemed hurried, and he kept glancing over his shoulder towards the house. "Here you are," he said, "across the yard there yonder. If you hammer on the door, they'll let you in. I must be getting on, or I'll not reach Launceston tonight." In a moment he was up on his seat again, picking up the reins. He shouted at his horses, whipping them in a fever of anxiety. The coach rumbled and shook, and in a moment he was away and down the road, disappearing as though it had never been, lost and swallowed up in darkness. Mary stood alone with the trunk at her feet. She heard a sound of bolts being drawn in the dark house behind her, and the door was flung open. A great figure strode in the yard, swinging a lantern from side to side. "Who is it?" came the shout. "What do you want here?" Mary stepped forward and peered up into the man's face. The light shone in her eyes, and she could see nothing. He swung the lantern to and fro before her, and suddenly he laughed and took hold of her arm, pulling her roughly inside the porch. "Oh, it's you, is it?" he said. "So you've come to us after all? I'm your uncle, Joss Merlin, and I bid you welcome to Jamaica Inn." He drew her into the shelter of the house, laughing again, and shut the door, and stood the lantern upon a table in the passage, and they looked upon each other face to face. 2. He was a great husk of a man, nearly 7 feet high, with a creased back brow, and a skin the color of gypsum. His thick dark hair fell over his eyes in a fringe that hung about his ears. He looked as if he had the strength of a horse, with immense, powerful shoulders, long arms that reached almost to his knees, and a large fist-like hands. His frame was so big that in a sense his head was dwarfed and sunk between his shoulders, giving the half-stooping impression of a giant gorilla with his black eyebrows and his mat of hair. But for all his long limbs and mighty frame, there was nothing of the ape about his features, for his nose was hooked, curving to a mouth that might have been perfect once, but now sunken and fallen, and there was still something fine about his great dark eyes, in spite of the lines and pouches and the red blood flecks. The best things left to him were his teeth, which were all good still, and very white, so that when he smiled, they showed out clearly against the tan of his face, giving him the lean and hungry appearance of a wolf. And though there should be a world of difference between the smile of a man and the bared fangs of a wolf, with Joss Merlin they were one and the same. "So you are Mary Ellen," he said at length, towering above her, his head bent to observe her more closely. "And you've come all this way to look after your Uncle Joss. I call it very handsome of you." He laughed again, mocking her, his laugh bellowing through the house, acting like a lash on the stone nerves of Mary. "Where is my Aunt Patience?" she asked, glancing around her in the dimly lit passage, cheerless with its cold stone flags and narrow rickety staircase. "Is she not expecting me, then?" "Where's my Aunt Patience?" mimicked the man. "Where's my dear auntie to kiss me and daddle me and make much of me? Can't you wait an instant without running to her? Haven't you a kiss for your Uncle Joss?" Mary drew back. The thought of kissing him revolted her. He was neither mad or drunk anyway, probably both. She did not want to anger him, though. She was too frightened for that. He saw the question pass through her mind, and he laughed again. "Oh, no," he said. "I'm not going to touch you. You're safe as a church with me. I never did like dark women, my dear, and I've better things to do than to play cat's cradle with me own niece." He jeered down at her contemptuously, treating her like a fool. Tired of his joke, then he lifted his head to the stairs. "Patience," he roared. "What the heck are you doing? Here's the girl arrived, whimpering for you. She's sick of the sight of me already." There was a little flutter at the head of the stairs, and a rude footstep dragged. Then the flicker of the candle and an exclamation. Down the narrow stairs came a woman, shielding the light from her eyes. She wore a dingy mob cap on her thin gray hair, which hung in elf locks to her shoulders. She had turned the edges of her hair in a vain attempt to recapture ringlets, but the curl had gone. Her face had fallen away, and the skin was stretched tight across her cheekbones. Her eyes were large and staring, as though they asked perpetually a question, and she had little nervous tick of working her mouth, now pursing the lips and now relaxing them. She wore a faded striped petticoat that had once been cherry-colored and was now washed-out pink, and over her shoulders was flung a much-mended shawl. She had obviously just strung a new ribbon in her cap, some small attempt to brighten her dress, and it struck a false, incongruous note. It was a bright scarlet, and showed up horrible contrast to the pallor of her face. Mary stared at her dumbly, stricken with sorrow. Was this poor tattered creature the bewitching Aunt Patience of her dreams, dressed now like a slattern, and 20 years her age? The little woman came down the stairs and into the hall. She took Mary's hands in hers and peered into her face. "Have you really come?" she whispered. "It is my niece, Mary Ellen, isn't it? My dead sister's child?" Mary nodded, thanking God that her mother could not see her now. "Dear Aunt Patience," she said gently, "I'm glad to see you again. It's many long years since you came to us at Helford." The woman kept pawing at her with her hands, stroking her clothes, feeling her, Suddenly she clung to her, burying her head against her shoulder, and she began to cry, loudly and fearfully, drawing her breath in gasps. "Oh, stop that!" growled her husband. "What sort of welcome is this? What have you got to squawk about, you darn fool? Can't you see the girl wants her supper? Get her out to the kitchen and give her some bacon and a drink." He went down and shouldered Mary's box as though it weighed less than a paper packet. "I'll take us to her room," he said. "And if you've got a bite of supper on the table by the time I'm down again, I'll give you something to cry about, and you too, if you like," he added, thrusting his face into Mary's and laying one great finger across her mouth. "Are you tame or do you bite?" he said, and then he laughed once more, bellowing to the roof, and thundered up the narrow stairs with the box swaying on his shoulders. Aunt Patience controlled herself. She made a tremendous effort and smiled, patting her thin locks into place in an old gesture that Mary would have remembered, and then, blinking nervously and working her mouth, she led the way to yet another murky passage, and so into the kitchen, which was lit by 3 candles, while a low turf fire smouldered on the hearth. "You mustn't mind your Uncle Joss," she said, her manner changing suddenly, fawning almost, like a whimpering dog that has been trained by constant cruelty to implicit obedience, and who, in spite of kicks and curses, will fight like a tiger for its master. "Your uncle must be humored, you know. He has his ways, and strangers don't understand him at first. He's a very good husband to me, and has been so since our wedding day." She pattered on mechanically, going backwards and forwards across the flagged kitchen, as she had laid the table for supper, taking bread, cheese, and dripping the big cupboard behind the paneling, while Mary crouched beside the fire in a hopeless attempt to warm her chilled fingers. The kitchen was heavy with peat smoke. It crept up the ceiling and into the corners and hung about the air like a thin blue cloud. It stung Mary's eyes and explored her nostrils and lay upon her tongue. "You'll soon come to like your Uncle Joss, and fit into his ways," continued her aunt. "He's a very fine man, and a very brave one. He has a great name hereabouts, and is much respected. There's no one will say a word against Joss Merlin. We have great company here at times. It's not always as quiet as this. It's a very busy highway, you know. The coaches pass every day, and the gentry are most civil to us, most civil. A neighbor was in only yesterday, and I made him cake to come to take home. 'Miss Merlin,' he said, 'you're the only woman in Cornwall can bake a cake.' Those were his very words, and even the squire himself, that's the Squire Basati, you know, from North Hill, he owns all the land hereabouts. He passed me on the road the other day, Tuesday it was, and he took off his hat. 'Good morning, madame,' he said, and he bowed to me from his horse. They say he was a great man for the women in his day. Then out comes Joss from the stable, where he'd been mending the wheel up the trap. 'How's your life, Mr. Basad?' he says. 'As large as yourself, Joss,' answers the squire, and they both fell to laughing." Mary murmured some reply to this little speech, but she was pained and worried to see how, when speaking, Aunt Patience avoided her eyes, and the very fluency of her words was in itself suspicious. She spoke much as a child does who tells herself a story and has talent for invention. It hurt Mary to see her act this part, and she longed for her to be done with it, or be silent, for the flow of words was, in its way, more appalling than her tears had been. There was a footfall outside the door, and with a sinking heart Mary realized that Joss Merlin had come downstairs again, and had in all possibility listened to his wife's conversation. Aunt Patience heard him too, for she turned pale and began to work her mouth. He came into the room and looked from one to the other. "So the hens are clacking already," he said, the smile and the laugh gone, his eyes narrow. "You'll soon stop your tears if you can talk. I heard you blathering fool. Gobble, 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 like a turkey hen. Do you think your precious niece believes a word you say? Why, you wouldn't take in a child, far less a bunch of petticoats like her." He pulled a chair from the wall and clashed it against the table. He sat down heavily, the chair creaking beneath him, and reaching for the loaf, cut himself a great hunk of bread, which he slabbed with dripping. He crammed it into his mouth, the grease running down his chin, and beckoned Mary to the table. "You need food, I can see that," he said, and proceeded to cut carefully a thin slice from the loaf, which he quartered in pieces and buttered for her, the whole business very delicately done, and in striking contrast to his manner in serving himself, so much so that there was something almost horrifying in the change from rough brutality to fastidious care. It was as though there was some latent power in his fingers which turned them from bludgeons into deft, cunning servants. Had he cut her a chunk of bread and hurled it at her, she still would not have minded so much. It would have been in keeping with what she had seen of him, but this sudden coming to grace, this quick and exquisite moving of his hands, was a swift and rather sinister revelation, sinister because it was unexpected and not true to type. She thanked him quietly and began to eat. Her aunt, who had not uttered since her husband entered the room, was frying bacon over the fire. No one spoke. Mary was aware of Joss Merlin watching her from across the table, and behind her She could hear her aunt fumbling with the ineffectual fingers at the hot handle of the frying pan. In a minute she had dropped it. Uttering a little cry of distress, Mary rose from her place to help her, but Joss thundered at her to sit down. "One full is bad enough without making a couple of them," he shouted. "Keep your seat and let your aunt clear up the mess." "It won't be for the first time." He leaned back in his chair and began to pick his teeth with his nails. "What'll you drink?" he asked her. "Brandy, wine, or ale? You may starve here, but you won't go thirsty. We don't get sore throats at Jamaica." He laughed at her, winked, and put out his tongue. "I'll have a cup of tea, if I may," said Mary. "I'm not used to drinking spirits nor wine neither." "Oh, you're not? Well, it's your loss, I'm glad to say. You can have your tea tonight, but by God, you'll want some brandy in a month or two." He reached out across the table and took hold of her hand. "You have a pretty enough paw for one who's worked on a farm," he said. "I was afraid it would be rough and red. If there's one thing that'll make a man sick, it's to have his ale poured out by an ugly hand. Not that my customers are over particular, but then we've never had a barmaid before at Jamaica Inn." He gave her a mock bow and dropped her hand. "Patience, my dear," he said. "Here's the key. Go and fetch me a bottle of brandy, for the Lord's sake. I've a thirst on me that all the waters of Dawsbury would not slake." His wife hurried across the room at his word, and disappeared into the passage. Then he fell to picking his teeth again, whistling from time to time, while Mary ate her bread and butter and drank the tea placed before her. Already splitting headache tightened her brow, and she was ready to drop. Her eyes watered from the peat smoke. But she was not too tired to watch her uncle, for already she had caught something of the nervousness of her Aunt Patience, and felt that in some sense they were here like mice in a trap. Unable to escape, with him playing with them like a monstrous cat. In a few minutes his wife returned with the brandy, with which she put in front of her husband, while she finished her cooking of the bacon, and served Mary and herself. He fell to drinking stereomotively before him, kicking the leg of the table. Suddenly he thumped the table with his fist, shaking the plates and the cups. With one clatter crashed to the floor and broke. "I'll tell you what it is, Mary Ellen," he shouted. "I'm master in this house, and I'll have you know it. You'll do as you're told, and help in the house and serve my customers, and I'll not lay a finger on you, but by God, if you open your mouth and squawk, I'll break you until you get out of my hand, the same as your aunt yonder." Mary faced him across the table. She held her hands in her lap so he could not see them tremble. "I understand you," she said. "I'm not curious by nature, and I've never gossiped in my life. It doesn't matter to me what you do in the inn, or what company you'll keep. I'll do my work about the house, and you'll have no cause to grumble. But if you hurt my Aunt Patience in any way, I tell you this, I'll leave Jamaica Inn straight away, and I'll find the magistrate, and bring him here, and have the law on you, and then try to break me if you like." Mary had turned very pale, and she knew that if he thundered at her now, she would break down and cry, and he would have the mastery of her forever. The torment of words had come from her in spite of herself, and wrung with pity for the poor broken thing that was her aunt. She could not control them. Had she but known it, she had saved herself, for a little show of spirit impressed the man, and he leaned back in his chair and relaxed. "That's very pretty," he said, "very prettily put, indeed. Now we know just what sort of lodger we have. Scratch her, and she knows her claws. All right, my dear, you and I are more akin than I thought. If we are going to play, we'll play together. I may have work for you at Jamaica by the one day, work you've never done before. Man's work, Mary Ellen, where you play with life and death." Mary heard her Aunt Patience give a little gasp beside her. "Oh, Joss," she whispered. "Oh, Joss, please." There was so much urgency in her voice that Mary stared at her in surprise. She saw her aunt lean forward and motion her husband to be silent, and the very eagerness of her chin and agony in her eyes frightened Mary more than anything that happened that night. She felt eerie suddenly, chilled, but rather sick. What had roused Aunt Patience to such panic? What had Joss Merlin been about to say? She was aware of a fevered and rather terrible curiosity. Her uncle waved his hand impatiently. "Get up to bed, Patience. I'm tired of your death's head at my supper table. This girl and I understand another." The woman rose at once and went to the door, with a last ineffectual glance of despair over her shoulder. They heard her patter up the stairs. Joss Merlin and Mary were alone. He pushed the empty brandy glass away from him and folded his arms on the table. "There's been one weakness in my life, and I'll tell you what it is," he said. "It's drink. It's a curse, and I know it. I can't stop myself. One day it'll be the end of me, and a good job, too. There's days go by, and I don't touch more than a drop, some as I've done tonight. And then I'll feel the thirst come on me, and I'll soak for hours. It's power, and glory, and women, and the kingdom of God all rolled into one. I feel a king then, Mary. I feel I've got the strings of the world between my two fingers. It's heaven and hell. I talk then. Talk until every darn thing I've ever done spilt into the four winds. I shut myself in my room and shout my secrets in my pillow. Your aunt turns the key on me, and when I'm sober I hammer on the door and she lets me out. There's no one knows that but she and I. And now I've told you. I've told you because I'm already a little drunk and I can't hold my tongue, but I'm not drunk enough to lose my head. I'm not drunk enough to tell you why I live in this godforsaken spot, and why I'm the landlord of Jamaica Inn. His voice was hoarse, and now he scarcely spoke above a whisper. The turf fire had sunk low in the hearth, and the dark shadows stretched long fingers on the wall. Candles, too, had burned down, and cast a monstrous shadow of Joss Merlin on the ceiling. He smiled at her, and with a foolish drunken gesture he laid his finger against his nose. "I've not told you that, Mary Ellen. Oh, no. I've got some sense and cunning left. If you want to know any more, you can ask your aunt. She'll pull you a tale. I heard her blathering tonight, telling you we kept fine company here, and the squire takes off his hat to her. It's all lies. Lies. I'll tell you that much, for you'll come to know it anyway. Squire Bassat's too mortal scared to shove his nose in here. If he saw me in the road, he'd cross his heart and spur his horse. And so would all the precious gentry. The coaches don't stop here now, nor the mails, neither. I don't worry, I've customers enough. The wider the berth the gentry to give me, the better pleased I am. Oh, there's drinking here all right, and plenty of it too. There's some who come to Jamaica Saturday night, and there's some who turn the key of the door and sleep with their fingers in their ears. There are nights when every cottage on the moors is dark and silent, and the only lights for miles are the blazing windows of Jamaica Inn. They say the shouting and the singing can be heard as far down as the farms below Roughter. You'll be in the bar those nights, if you've a fancy for it, and you'll see what company I keep." Mary sat very still, gripping the sides of her chair. She dared not move for fear of the swift changing of his mood, which she had observed already, and which would turn him from his sudden intimate tone of confidence to a harsh and coarse brutality. "They're all afraid of me," he went on, "the whole darned lot of 'em. Afraid of me, who's afraid of no man? I tell you, if I'd had a learning, I'd have walked the breadth of England beside King George himself. It's drink that's been against me, drink in my hot blood. It's the curse of all of us, Mary. There's never been a Merlin that died a peaceful in his bed. My father hanged at Exeter. He had a brawl with a fellow, and killed him. My granddad had his ears cut for thieving. He was sent out to a convict settlement, and died raving mad from a snake bite in the tropics. I'm the eldest of 3 brothers, all of us born under the shadow of Kilmer, away yonder above Twelman's Moor. You walk out over there, across the east moor, till you come to Rushford, and you'll see a great crag of granite, like a devil's hand, sticking up to the sky. That's Kilmer. If you'd been born under its shadow, you'd take to drink same as I did. My brother Matthew, he was drowned in Trewortham Marsh. We thought he'd gone for a sailor, and had no news of him. And then in the summer there was a drought, and no rain fell for 7 months. And there was Matthew sticking up in the bog, with his hands above his head, the curlews flying around him. My brother Jim, darn him, he was the baby, hanging on to mother's skirts when Matt and I were grown men. I never did see eye to eye with Jim. He's too smart, he is, too sharp with his tongue. Oh, they'll catch him in time to hang him, same as they did my father." He fell silent a moment, gazing at his empty glass. He picked it up and put it down again. "No," he said, "I've had enough. I'll have no more tonight. Go up to bed, Mary, before I wring your neck. Here's the candle. You'll find your room over the porch." Mary took the candlestick without speaking, and was about to pass him, when he seized hold of her shoulder and twisted around. "There'll be nights sometimes when you'll hear wheels on the road," he said, "and those wheels will not pass on, and they'll stop outside Jamaica Inn. And you'll hear footsteps in the yard and voices beneath your window. When that happens, you'll stay in your bed, Mary Ellen. You'll cover your head with the blankets, you understand?" "Yes, uncle." "Very well. Now get out. If you ever ask me a question again, I'll break every bone in your body." She went out of the room and into the dark passage, bumping against the settle in the hall, and so upstairs, feeling her way with her hands, judging her whereabouts by turning round and facing the stairs again. Her uncle had told her the room over the porch, and she crept across the dark landing, which was unlit, past 2 doors on either side, guest rooms, she imagined, waiting for those travelers who never came nowadays, nor sought shelter beneath the roof at Jamaica Inn, and then stumbled against another door and turned the handle, and saw by the flickering flame of the candle that this was her room, for her trunk lay on the floor. The walls were rough and unprepared, and the floorboards bare. A box turned upside down served as a dressing table, with a cracked looking-glass on top. There was no jug or basin. She was supposed to wash in the kitchen. The bed creaked when she leaned upon it, and the 2 thin blankets felt damp to her hand. She decided she would not undress, but would lie down upon it in her traveling clothes, dusty as they were, with a cloak wrapped around her. She went to the window and looked out. The wind had dropped, but it was still raining, a thin, wretched drizzle that trickled down the side of the house and smeared the dirt on the window pane. A noise came from the far end of the yard, a curious groaning sound like an animal in pain. It was too dark to see clearly, but she could make out a dark shape swinging gently to and fro. For one nightmare of a moment, her imagination on fire with the tales Joss Merlin had told her, and she thought it was a gibbet, and a dead man hanging. And then she realized it was the sight born of the inn, that somehow or other, through neglect, had become insecure upon its nails and now swung backwards forwards with the slightest breeze. Nothing but a poor battered board that had once known prouder days in its first direction, but whose white lettering was now blurred and gray, and whose message was at the mercy of the four winds, Jamaica Inn, Jamaica Inn. Mary pulled down the blind and crept to her bed. Her teeth were chattering and her feet and hands were numb. For a long while she sat huddled on the bed, a prey to despair. She wondered whether it was possible to break from the house and find a way back to the 12 long miles to Bowman. She wondered whether her weariness would prove too much for her, and if with an agony of fatigue she would drop by the roadside and fall asleep where she lay, only to be wakened by the morning light and to see the great form of Joss Merlin towering above her. She closed her eyes, and at once she saw his face smiling at her, and then the smile changing to a frown, the frown breaking into 1,000 creases as he shook with rage, and she saw his great mat of black hair, his hooked nose, and the long powerful fingers that held such deadly grace. She felt caught here now like a bird in a net, and however much she struggled she would never escape. She wished to be free. She must go now, climb from her window, and run like a mad thing along the white road that stretched like a snake across the moors. Tomorrow it would be too late. She waited until she heard his footsteps on the stairs. She heard him mutter to himself, and to her relief he turned aside and went along the other passage to the left of the staircase. In the distance a door closed, and there was silence. She decided that she would wait no longer. If she stayed even one night beneath this roof, her nerve would go from her, and she would be lost. Lost and mad and broken, like Aunt Patience. She opened the door and stole into the passage. She tiptoed to the head of the stairs. She paused and listened. Her hand was on the banister and her foot on the top of the stair when she heard a sound from the other passage. It was somebody crying. It was someone whose breath came in little gasps and spasms, who tried to muffle a sound in the pillow. It was Aunt Patience. Mary waited a moment, and then she turned back and went to her own room again, and threw herself on her bed and closed her eyes. Whatever she would have to face in the future, and however frightened she would be, she would not leave Jamaica Inn now. She must stay with Aunt Patience. She was needed here. It might be that Aunt Patience would take comfort from her, and then they would come to an understanding, and in some way, which she was now too tired to plan, Mary would act as a protector to Aunt Patience, and stand between her and Joss Merlin. For 17 years her mother had lived and worked alone, and known greater hardships than Mary would ever know. She would not have to run away because of half-crazy men. She would not have feared a house that reeked of evil, however lonely it stood on its wind-blown hill, a solitary landmark defying man and storm. Mary's mother would have the courage to fight her enemies, yes, and conquer them in the end. There would be no giving way for her. And so Mary lay upon her hard bed, her mind teeming while she prayed for sleep, every sound a fresh stab to her nerves, from the scratching of a mouse in the wall behind her to the creaking of the sign in the yard. She counted the minutes and the hours of an eternal night, and when the first cock crew in the fields behind the house, she counted no more, but sighed and slept like a dead thing. 3. Mary woke to a high wind from the west, and a thin, watery sun. It was the rattling of the window that roused her from her sleep, and she judged from the broad daylight and the color of the sky that she had slept late, and that it must be past 8 o'clock. Looking out of the window and across the yard, she saw that the stable door was open, and there were fresh hoof marks in the mud outside. With a great sense of relief, she realized that the landlord must have gone from home, and she would have Patience to herself if only for a little time. Hurriedly, she unpacked her trunk, pulling out her thick skirt and colored apron, and the heavy shoes that she had worn at the farm, and in 10 minutes she was down in the kitchen, washing in the scullery at the back. Aunt Patience came in from the chicken run behind the house with some new-laid eggs in her apron, which she produced with a little smile of mystery. "I thought you'd like one for breakfast," she said. "I saw you were too tired to eat much last night, and I've saved you a spot of cream for your bread." Her manner was normal enough this morning, and in spite of the red rims around her eyes which bespoke an anxious night, she was obviously making an effort to be cheerful. Mary decided it was only in the presence of her husband that she went to pieces like a frightened child, and when he was away that the same child's aptitude for forgetting, and could seize pleasure from little situations such as this of making breakfast for Mary and boiling her an egg. They both avoided any reference to the night before, and Joss's name was not mentioned. Where he had gone and on what business, Mary neither asked nor cared. She was only too relieved to be rid of him. Mary could see that her aunt was eager to speak of things unconnected with her present life, She seemed afraid of any questions, so Mary spared her, and plunged into a description of the last years at Helford, the strain of the bad times and her mother's illness and death. Whether Aunt Patience took it in or not, she could tell. Certainly she nodded from time to time and pursed her lips, and shook her head and uttered little ejaculations, but it seemed to Mary that years of fear and anxiety had taken away her powers of concentration, that some underlying terror prevented her from giving her whole interest to any conversation. During the morning there was the usual work of the house, and Mary was thus able to explore the inn more thoroughly. It was a dark, rambling place, with long passages and unexpected rooms. There was a separate entrance to the bar at the side of the house, and though the room was empty now, there was something heavy in the atmosphere, reminiscent of the last time it was full. A lingering taste of old tobacco, the sour smell of a drink, and an impression of warm, unclean humanity packed one against the other on the dark-stained benches, for all the unpleasant suggestion that it conjured. It was the one room in the inn that had vitality, and it was not more and drear. The other rooms appeared neglected or unused. Even the parlor by the entrance porch had a solitary air, as though it were many months since an honest traveller had stepped upon the threshold and warmed his back before a glowing fire. The guest room upstairs were in an even worse state of repair. One was used for lumber, with boxes piled against the wall, and old horse blankets chewed and torn by families of rats or mice. In the room opposite, potatoes and turnips had been stored upon a broken-down bed. Mary guessed that her own small room had been in much the same condition, and that she owed it to her aunt that it was now furnished at all. Into their room, along the further passage, she did not venture. Beneath it, down a passage that ran parallel to the one above, long and in the opposite direction from the kitchen, was another room, the door of which was locked. Mary went out into the yard to look at it through the window, but there was a board nailed up against the frame, and she could not see inside. The house and outbuildings formed three sides of the little square that was the yard, in the center of which was a grass bank and a drinking trough. Beyond this lay the road, the thin white ribbon stretched on either side to the horizon, surrounded on each side by moorland, brown and sodden from the heavy rains. Mary went on to the road and looked about her, and as far as her eyes could see there was nothing but the black hills and the moors. The grey slate inn, with all its tall chimneys, forbidding and uninhabited though it seemed, was the only dwelling place on the landscape. To the west of Jamaica Inn high tors reared their heads. Some were smooth like downland, and the grass shone yellow under the fitful winter sun, but others were sinister and austere, their peaks crowned with granite and great slabs of stone. Now and again the sun was obscured by cloud, and long shadows fled over the moors like fingers. Colors came in patches. Sometimes the hills were purple, ink-stained and mottled, and then feeble ray of sun would come for the wisp of cloud, and one hill would be golden brown while his neighbor still languished in the dark. The scene was never once the same, for it would be the glory of the high noon to the east, with the moor as motionless as desert sand, and away to the westward Arctic's winter fell upon the hills, brought by a jagged cloud shaped like a highwayman's cloak, that scattered hail and snow and a sharp spittle rain into the giant granite tors. The air was strong and sweet-smelling, cold as mountain air, and strangely pure. It was a revelation to Mary, unaccustomed as she was to the warm and soft climate of Helford, with its high hedges and tall protecting trees. Even the east wind had been no hardship here, for the arm of the headland acted as a defence to those on land, and it was only the river that ran turbulent and green, the wave-crest whipped with foam. However grim and hateful was this new country, however barren and untilled, with Jamaica Inn standing alone upon the hill as a buffer to the four winds, there was a challenge in the air that spurred Mary Ellen to adventure. It stung her, bringing color to her cheeks and a sparkle to her eyes. It played with her hair, blowing it about her face, and as she breathed deep, she drew it through her nostrils and into her lungs, more quenching and sweeter than a draught of cider. She went to the water trough and put her hands under the spring. The water ran clear and icy cold. She drank some, and it was unlike any water she had drunk before, bitter, queer, with a lingering peat taste, like the smoke from the turf fire in the kitchen. It was deep and satisfying, for her thirst went from her. She felt strong in her body and emboldened in spirit, and she went back into the house to find Aunt Patience, her appetite sharp for the dinner she hoped awaited her. She fell to with a will upon the stewed mutton and turnips, and her hunger appeased now, for the first time in 24 hours. She felt her courage to return to her, and she was ready to question her aunt about and risk the consequences. "Aunt Patience," she began, "why is my uncle the landlord of Jamaica Inn?" The sudden direct attack took the woman by surprise, and for a moment she stared at Mary without reply. Then she flushed scarlet and began to work her mouth. "Why," she faltered, it's a very prominent place here on the road, you can see that. This is the main road from the south. The coach passes here twice a week. They come from Truro, both sailors. From Falmouth. Yes, Aunt Patience, but why don't they stop at Jamaica? They do. They often ask for a drink at the bar. We've a good custom here. How can you say that when the parlor is never used and the guest rooms are stored with lumber, fit only for rats and mice? I've seen them for myself. I've been to inns before, smaller ones than this by far. There was an inn at home in the village. The landlord was a friend of ours. Many a time Mother and I had tea in the parlor, and upstairs, though there were only 2 rooms, they were furnished and fitted up in the style for travelers. Her aunt was silent for a moment, working her mouth and twisting her fingers in her lap. Your Uncle Joss doesn't encourage folk to stay, she said at length. He says you never know who are going to get. Why, at a lonely spot like this we might be murdered in our beds. There's all sorts on a road like this. It wouldn't be safe. Aunt Patience, you're talking nonsense. What is the use of an inn that cannot give an honest traveler a bed for the night? For what other purpose was it built? And how do you live if you have no custom? We have custom, returned the woman sullenly. I've told you that. There's men come in from the farms and outlying places. The farms and cottages scattered over these moors for miles round, and folk come from there. There are evenings where the bar is full of them. And the driver on the coach yesterday told me respectable people did not come to Jamaica any more. He said they were afraid. Aunt Patience changed color. She was pale now, and her eyes roved from side to side. She swallowed and ran her tongue over her lips. Your Uncle Joss has a strong temper, she said. You have seen that for yourself. He is easily roused, and he will not have folk interfering with him. Aunt Patience, why should anyone interfere with the landlord of an inn who goes about his rightful business? However hot-tempered a man may be, his temper doesn't scare people away. That's no excuse. Her aunt was silent. She had come to the end of her resources, and sat stubborn as a mule. She would not be drawn. Mary tried another question. Why did you come here in the first place? My mother knew nothing of this. We believed you to be in Bodmin. You wrote from there when you were married. I met your uncle in Bodmin, but we never lived there, replied Aunt Patience slowly. We lived near a padstow for a while, and then we came here. Your uncle brought the inn from Mr. Bassat. It had stood empty a number of years, I believe, and your uncle decided it would suit him. He wanted to settle down. He's traveled a lot in his time. He's been to more places than I can remember the names. I believe he was in America once. It seems a funny thing to come to this place to settle, said Mary. He couldn't have chosen much worse, could he? It's near his old home, said her aunt. Your uncle was born only a few miles away, over on the 12 Men's Moor. His brother Jim lives there now with a bit of cottage. When he's not roaming the country, he comes here sometimes, but your Uncle Joss does not care for it much. Does Mr. Bassat ever visit the inn? No. Why not if he sold it to my uncle? Aunt Patience fidgeted with her fingers and worked her mouth. There was some misunderstanding, she replied. Your uncle bought it through a friend. Mr. Bassat did not know who Uncle Joss was until we were settled in, and then he was not very pleased. Why did he mind? He had not seen your uncle since he lived at Trewartha as a young man. Your uncle was wild as a lad. He got a name for acting rough. It wasn't his fault, Mary. It was his misfortune. The Merlins were all wild. His young brother Jim is worse than he ever was, and I am sure of that. But Mr. Bassat listened to a pack of lies about Uncle Joss, and it was in a great way that he discovered that he'd sold Jamaica to him. There, that's all there is to it. She leaned back in her chair, exhausted from her cross-examination. Her eyes begged to be excused further questioning, and her face was pale and drawn. Mary saw she had suffered enough, but with the rather cruel audacity of youth, she ventured one question more. Aunt Patience, she said, I want you to look at me and answer this, and then I won't worry you again. What has the barred room at the end of the passage to do with the wheels that stop outside Jamaica Inn by night? As soon as she had spoken, she was sorry, and like many a one before her, who has spoken too hastily and too soon, she yearned for the words to be unsaid. It was too late, though, now. The damage had been done. A strange expression crept upon the woman's face, and her great hollowed eyes stared across the table in terror. Her mouth trembled, and her hand wandered to her throat. She looked fearful, haunted. Mary pushed her back her chair and knelt by her side. She put her arms around Aunt Patience, held her close, and kissed her hair. I'm sorry, she said. Don't be angry with me. I'm rude and impertinent. It's none of my business, and I've no right to question you, and I'm ashamed of myself. Please, please forget what I said. Her aunt buried her face in her hands. She sat motionless and paid no attention to her niece. For some minutes they sat there in silence, while Mary stroked her shoulder and kissed her hands. Then Aunt Patience uncovered her face and looked down at her. The fear had gone from her eyes, and she was calm. She took Mary's hands in hers and gazed into her face. "Mary," she said, and her voice was hushed and low, scarcely above a whisper. "Mary, I can't answer your questions, for there are many I don't know the answer of myself, but because you are my niece, my own sister's child, I must give you a word of warning." She glanced over her shoulder, as though she were afraid that Joss himself stood in the shadows behind the door. "There's little things that happen at Jamaica, Mary, that I've never dared to breathe. Bad things. Evil things. I can't never tell you. I can't even admit them to myself. Some of it in time you'll come to know. You can't avoid it living here. Your Uncle Joss mixes with strange men who follow a strange trade. Sometimes they come by night, and from your window above the porch you'll hear footsteps and voices and knocking at the door. Your uncle lets them in, and he takes them along that passage to the room with the locked door. They go inside, and from my bedroom above I can hear the mutter of their voices through the long hours. Before dawn they are away, and no sign left that they have ever been. When they come, Mary, you will say nothing to me or to your Uncle Joss. You must lie in bed and put your fingers to your ears. You must never question me, nor him, nor anyone, for if you came to guess but half of what I know, your hair would go gray, Mary, as mine has done, and you would tremble in your speech and weep by night, and all that lovely careless youth of yours would die, Mary, as mine has died." Then she rose from the table and pushed aside her chair, and Mary heard her climb the staircase with heavy, faltering feet, and so along the landing to her room, and so close to the door. Mary sat on the floor beside an empty chair, and she saw through the kitchen window that the sun had already disappeared behind the furthest hill, and that before many hours had passed the grey malevolence of a November dusk would have fallen upon Jamaica once again. 4. Joss Merlin was away from the home for nearly a week, and during that time Mary came to know something of the country. Her presence was not required at the bar, for no one came to it when the landlord was from home, and after giving her aunt a hand with the housework and in the kitchen, she was free to wander where she pleased. Patience Merlin was no walker. She had no wish to stir behind the chicken run at the back of the inn, and she had no sense of direction. She had a vague idea of the names and of the tours. She had heard them mentioned by her husband, but where they were and how anyone found them she did not know. So Mary would strike off on her own at midday, with nothing but the sun to guide her, and a certain deep-gained common sense which was her natural inheritance as a countrywoman. The moors were even wilder than she had first supposed. Like an immense desert, they rolled from east to west like tracks here and there across the surface of great hills breaking the skyline. Where was their final boundary she could not tell, except that once, away to the westward, after climbing the highest from behind Jamaica, she caught the silver shimmer of the sea. It was a silent, desolate country, though vast and untouched by human hand. On the high tors, the slab of stone leaned against one another in strange shapes and forms, massive sentinels who had stood there since the hands of God first fashioned them. Some were shaped like giant furniture, with monstrous chairs and twisted tables, and sometimes the smaller crumbling stones lay on the summit of the hill, like a giant himself, his huge, recumbent form darkening the heather and the coarse tufted grass. There were long stones that stood on end, balancing themselves in a queer, miraculous way, as though they leaned against the wind, and there were flat altar stones whose smooth and polished faces stared up towards the sky, awaiting a sacrifice that never came. Wild sheep dwelt on the high tors, and there were ravens too, and buzzards, and the hills were homing places for all solitary things. Black cattle grazed on the moors beneath, their careful feet treading firm ground, and with inborn knowledge they avoided the tufted, tempting grass that was not grass at all, but soggy marsh that sighed and whispered. When the wind blew on the hills, it whistled mournfully in the crevices of granite, and sometimes it shuddered like a man in pain. Strange winds blew from nowhere. They crept along the surface of the grass, and in the grass shivered. They breathed upon the little pools of rain in the hollowed stones, and the pools rippled. Sometimes the wind shouted and cried, and the cry echoed in the crevices and moaned and was lost again. There was a silence on the tors that belonged to another age, an age that is past and vanished as though it had never been, an age when men did not exist, but pagan footsteps trod upon the hills. There was a stillness. There was a stillness in the air, and a strange older peace that was not the peace of God. As Mary Ellen walked the moors, climbed the tors, and wrestled in the low dips beside the springs and streams, she thought about Joss Merlin and what his boyhood must have been, and how he grew athwart like the stunted broom, when the bloom blown out of him with the north wind. One day she crossed the east moor on the direction he had given her that first evening. and she walked some way, and stood alone upon the ridge of down. Surrounded on all sides by a bleak moorland, she saw that the land descended to a deep and treacherous marsh, through which a brook burbled and sang, and rising beyond the marsh, away on the other side, pointing his great fingers to the sky, was a crag like a spilt hand, coming sheer out of the moor, to his surface moulded in granite, as though sculpted, his slope a venomous grey. So this was Kilmar Tor, and somewhere along that solid mass of stone, where the ridges hid the sun, Joss Merlin had been born, and his brother lived today. Below her in the marsh, Matthew Merlin had been drowned. In her fancy she saw him stride across the high ground, whistling a song, and the murmur of the brook in his ears, and somehow evening came upon him before he was aware, and his footsteps faltered as he turned in his tracks. In her fancy she watched him pause and think a moment and curse softly, and then with a shrug of his shoulders he plunged down into the mist, his confidence returning, but before he had taken 5 steps he felt the ground sag under his feet, and he stumbled and fell, and suddenly he was up above his knees in weed and slime. He reached out for a tuft of grass, and it sank beneath his weight. He kicked with his feet, and it would not answer him. He kicked once more, and one foot sucked itself free, but he plunged forward, reckless and panic-stricken, the trod deeper water still, and now he floundered helplessly, beating the weed with his hands. She heard him scream in terror, and a curlew rose from the marsh in front of him, flapping his wings and whistling his mournful cry. When the curlew had flown from sight, disappearing behind a ridge of land, the marsh was still again. Only a few grass stems shivered in the wind, and there was silence. Mary turned her back upon Kilmer and began to run across the moor, stumbling among the heather and the stones. Nor did she stop until the marsh had sunk beneath the level of the hill and the crag itself was hidden. She had come further than she intended, and the way home was long. It seemed an eternity before the hill was conquered, and behind her, and the tall chimneys of the Jamaica Inn stood out before her above the winding road. As she crossed the yard, she noticed with a sinking heart that the stable door was open, and the pony was inside. Joss Merlin had returned. She opened the door as silently as possible, but it rubbed against the stone flags, and grated in protest. The sound rang in the quiet passage, and in a minute the landlord appeared from the back, bending his hand under the beam. His shirt sleeves were rolled above his elbow, and he had a glass in his hand to cough. He was, it seemed, in high good humor, for he shouted boisterously at Mary, and waved the glass. "Well," he roared, "don't drop your face a smile at the sight of me. Aren't you pleased to see me? Did you miss me much?" Mary made an effort to smile, and asked him if he had a pleasant journey. "Pleasant be darned," he answered. "There was money in it, that's all I care. I've not been staying in the palace with the king, if that's what you mean." He shouted with laughter at his joke, and his wife appeared behind his shoulder, simpering in harmony. As soon as his laughter died away, the smile faded from Aunt Patience's face, and the strained, haunted expression returned again, the fixed, almost idiot stare that she wore habitually in the presence of her husband. Mary saw at once that the little freedom of the care with which her aunt had enjoyed during the past week was now no more, and she had again become the nervy, shattered creature of before. Mary turned to go to the stairs to her room when Joss called to her. "Here," he said, "no skulking up there this evening. There will be work for you in the bar alongside your uncle. Don't you know what day of the week it is?" Mary paused to think. She was losing count of time. Was it Monday's coach she had taken? That made today Saturday night. At once she realized what Joss Merlin meant. Tonight there would be company at Jamaica Inn. They came singly, the people of the moors, crossing the yard swiftly and silently as though they had no wish to be seen. They lacked substance in the dim light, and seemed no more than shadows as they skirted the wall and passed under the shelter of the porch to knock upon the door in the bar and gain admittance. Some carried lanterns, the fitful glare of which appeared to worry the bearers, for they attempted to screen the glow by covering it with their coats. One or two rode in the yard on ponies, whose hoofs rang sharply on the stones, and the clatter sounded strangely in the still night, followed as it was by the creaking of the stable door yawning on its hinges, and the low mutter of voices as the men led their ponies to the stalls. Others were yet more furtive, bearing neither flare nor lantern, but flitting across the yard with hats pulled low and coats muffled to the chin, betraying the very secrecy of their movements, their desire to remain unseen. The reason for stealth was not apparent, for any passing traveler upon the road could see that tonight Jamaica Inn gave hospitality. The light streamed from the windows, usually so shuttered and barred, and as the evening darkened and the hours went by, the sound of voices rose upon the air. There was singing at times, and shouting, and the grumble of laughter. Showing that those visitors to the inn who came so furtively, as if in shame, had lost their fear when under cover of the house, and once packed close to their companions in the bar, with pipes alight and glasses filled, had thrown all caution aside. They were a strange assortment gathered there, grouped around Joss Merlin in the bar. Securely separated by the counter itself and a half screened by a barrier of bottles and glasses, Mary could look down upon the company and remain unobserved. They straddled the stools and sprawled upon the benches. They leaned against the wall, they slouched beside the tables, and one or two, whose heads and stomachs were weaker than the rest, already lay full length upon the floor. They were dirty for the most part, ragged, ill-kept, with matted hair and broken nails, tramps, vagrants, poachers, thieves, cattle stealers, and gypsies. There was a farmer who had lost his farm through bad management and dishonesty, a shepherd who had fired his master's rick, a horse dealer who had been hounded out of a Devon. One fellow was a cobbler in Launceston, and under cover of his trade passed stolen goods. He who lay in a drunken stupor on the floor was once a mate of Padstow schooner, and had run his ship ashore. The little man who sat in the far corner, biting his nails, was a Port Isaac fisherman. The rumor had it that he kept a store of gold rolled up in a stocking and hidden in the chimney of his cottage, but where the gold came from no one could say. There were other men who lived nearby under the very shadow of the tors who had known no other country but moorland, marsh, and granite. One had come walking without a lantern from the crowdy marsh beyond the Rufter, taking Brown Willie in his stride. Another came from Cheerwing, and sat now with his face in a mug of ale, his boots on a table side by side with poor half-witted fellow who had stumbled upon the lane from Rosemary. The last had a birthmark that ran the whole length of his straight face, blazing at purple, and he kept plucking at it with his hands, pulling it out his cheek, so that Mary, who stood in line with him, for all the bottles that divided them, turned sick and nearly faint at the sight of him, and what with the stale drink smell, and the reek of tobacco, and the foul atmosphere of crowded unwashed bodies, she felt a physical disgust rise up in her, and she knew that she would give way if she stayed there for long. Luckily, she did not have to move among them. Her duty was to stand behind the bar, hidden as much as possible, and then do what washing and cleaning of glasses was required, refilling them from trap or bottle, while Joss Merlin himself handed them to his customers, or lifted the flap of the bar and strode out into the room, laughing at one, flinging a coarse word at another, patting someone on the shoulder, jerking his head at another. After the first hilarious outburst, the first curious stare, the shrug of the shoulder and a chuckle, the company gathered at the inn ignored Mary. They accepted her as niece of the landlord, a sort of serving maid of Merlin's wife, and she was introduced, and although one of the younger men would have spoken to her and plagued her, they were wary of the eye, and the landlord himself, fearing that any familiarity on their part might anger him, as he had probably brought her to Jamaica for his own amusement, so Mary was left undisturbed, greatly to her relief. Though she had known the reason for their reticence, she would have walked out of the bar that night in shame and loathing. Her aunt did not appear before the company, though Mary was aware of her shadow behind the door at times, and a footstep in the passage, and once she caught sight of her frightened eyes peering through the crack in the door. The evening seemed interminable, and Mary longed for the release. The air was so thick with smoke and breath that it was hard to see across the room, and to her weary half-closed eyes, the faces of the men loomed shapeless and distorted, all hair and teeth, their mouths much too large for their bodies, while those who had drunk their fill and could take no more lay on the benches of the floor like dead men, their faces in their hands. Those who remained sufficiently sober to stand and crowded around a dirty little blackguard from Redruth, who had established himself wood of the assembly. The mine where he had worked were now in ruins, and he had taken to the road as tinker, peddler, begman, and had stored up a consequence of just string of loathsome songs, gleaned perhaps from the bowels of the black earth, where he had once entombed himself, and where these jewels he had provided entertainment to the company at Jamaica Inn. The laughter that greeted the sallies nearly shook the roof, topped, of course, by the bellows of the landlord himself, and to Mary there was something appalling to this ugly, screaming laughter, which in some strange way held not a note of mirth, but echoed down the dark stone passages and into the empty rooms above like a tortured thing. The peddler was making bait of the wretched idiot from Dawsbury, who, crazy from drink, had no control of himself and could not rise from the floor, where he squatted like an animal. They lifted him onto the table, and the peddler made him repeat the words of his songs, complete with actions amid the frenzied laughter of the crowd. And the poor beast, excited by the applause that greeted him, jigged up and down on the table, whinnying in delight, plucking at his spotted purple birthmark with a broken fingernail. Mary could bear it no longer. She touched her ankle on the shoulder, and he turned to her, his face blotched with the heat of the room and streaming with perspiration. "I can't stand this," she said. "You'll have to attend to your friends yourself. I'm going upstairs to my room." He wiped the sweat from his forehead with his shirt sleeve and stared down at her. She was surprised to see that although he had been drinking during the evening, he was himself sober, even if he was the ringleader of this riotous, crazy company. He knew what he was doing. "Had enough of it, have you?" he said. "Think yourself a little bit too good for such as we? I'll tell you this, Mary. You had an easy time behind the bar, and you ought to go down on your knees and thank me for it, because you're my niece they've let you alone, my dear. But if you hadn't had that honor, by God, there wouldn't be much left of you now." He shouted with laughter and pinched her cheek between his finger and thumb, hurting her. "Get out, then," he just said. "It's close on midnight anyway, and I don't want you. You'll lock your door tonight, Mary, and pull down your blind. Your aunt's been in bed an hour with a blanket drawn over her head." He lowered his voice, bending down to her ear and seizing her wrist. He doubled it behind her back until she cried out in pain. "All right," he said. "That's like a foretaste of punishment, and you'll know what to expect. Keep your mouth shut, and I'll treat you like a lamb. It doesn't do to be curious at Jamaica Inn, and I'll have you remember it." He was not laughing now, but stared down at her, frowning, as though he could read her thoughts. "You're not a fool like your aunt," he said slowly. "That's the curse of it. You've got a clever little monkey face and a ferreting monkey mind, and you're not easily scared. But I'll tell you this, Mary Ellen, I'll break that mind of yours if you let it go astray, and I'll break your body too. Now go upstairs to bed, and let's hear no more of you tonight." He turned away from her, and frowning still, picked up a glass from the bar in front of him, turning it over and over in his hands, rubbing it slowly like a cloth. The contempt in her eyes must have irritated him, for his good humor had left him in a flash, and he flung aside the glass in a fit of ill temper, splitting into fragments. "Strip that darned idiot of his clothes," he thundered, "and send him back naked to his mother. Maybe the November air will cool that purple face of his and cure his dog tricks. We've had enough of him at Jamaica." The peddler and his group yelled in delight, and throwing the wretched half-wit on his back, began to tear his coat and breeches, while the bewildered fellow flapped out at them with useless hands, bleating like a sheep. Mary ran out of the room, slamming the door behind her. As she went up the rickety stairs, her hands over her ears, she could not keep out that sound of laughter and wild song that echoed down the Daphne passage, following her to the room, penetrating through the cracks of the floorboards. She felt very sick and threw herself on her bed, her head in her hands. There was a babble of noise in the yard below and wails of laughter, while a stream of light from a tossing lantern cast a beam up to her window. She got up, pulled down the blind up before she had seen an outline of a quivering naked form, bound across the yard with great-looking strides, screaming like a heron, pursued by a handful of hooting, jeering men, with Joss Merlin's giant figure in the lead, cracking a horsewhip above his head. Then Mary did as her uncle had told her. She undressed hurriedly, and crept into bed, pulling the blanket over her head, stuffing her fingers in her ears, her only thought now to be deaf to the horror and the revelry below. But even with eyes shut and face pressed tight against the pillow, she could see the purple-blotched face of the poor old man upturned towards his captors, and she could hear the thin echo of his cry as he stumbled into the ditch and fell. She lay in that half-conscious state that waits on the borderland of sleep, when the events of the past day crowd into the mind and make a jumble of confusion. Images danced before her, and the heads of unknown people, and though at times she seemed to be wandering on a moor, with the great crag of Kilmar dwarfing the neighboring hills, she was afraid of the little path of light made by the moon on her bedroom floor, and the steady rattle of the window blind. There had been voices, now there were none. Somewhere far away on the high road a horse galloped, wheels rumbled, but now all was still. She slept, and then without warning she heard something snap in a piece of mind that enfolded her, and she was awake suddenly, sitting up in bed with the moonlight streaming on her face. She listened, hearing nothing at first but the thumping of her own heart, but in a few minutes there came another sound, from beneath her room this time, the sound of heavy things being dragged along the stone flags in the passage downstairs, thumping against the walls. She got out of bed and went to the window, pulling aside an inch of blind. 5 wagons were drawn up in the yard outside. 3 were covered, each drawn by a pair of horses, and remaining 2 were open farm carts. One of the covered wagons stood directly beneath the porch, and the horses were streaming. Gathered round the wagons were some of the men who had been drinking in the bar earlier that evening. The cobbler from Launceston, who was standing under Mary's window, talking to the horse dealer. The sailor from Padstow had come to his senses and was patting the head of the horse. The peddler who had tortured the poor idiot was climbing into one of the open carts and lifting something from the floor. And there were strangers in the yard whom Mary had never seen before. She could see their faces clearly because of the moonlight, the very brightness of which seemed to worry the men, for one of them pointed upwards and shook his head while his companion shrugged his shoulders, and another man, who had a fair air of authority about him, waved his arm impatiently as though urging him to make haste, and the 3 of them turned at once and passed under the porch into the inn. Meanwhile, the heavy dragging sound continued, and Mary could trace the direction of it without difficulty from where she stood. Something was being taken along the passage to the room at the end, the room with the barred windows and bolted door. She began to understand. Packages were brought by wagons and unloaded at Jamaica Inn. They were stored in the locked room. Because the horses were steaming, they had come from a great distance, from the coast perhaps, and as soon as the wagons were unloaded, they would take their departure, passing out into the night as swiftly and silently as they had come. The men in the yard worked quickly, against time. The contents of the uncovered wagon were not carried into the inn, but were transferred to one of the open farm carts drawn up beside the drinking well across the yard. The packages seemed to vary in size and description. Some were large parcels, some were small, and others were long rolls, wrapped round about in straw and paper. When the cart was filled, the driver, a stranger to Mary, climbed into the seat and drove away. The remaining wagons were unloaded one by one, and the packages were either placed in open carts and driven out of the yard, or were borne by the men into the house. All was done in silence. Those men who had shouted and sung earlier that night were now sober and quiet, bent over their business in hand. Even the horses appeared to understand the need for silence, and they stood motionless. Joss Merlin came out to the porch, the peddler at his side. Neither wore no coat nor hat, in spite of the cold air, and both had sleeves rolled to the elbows. "Is that the lot?" the landlord called softly, and the driver of the last wagon nodded and held up his hand. The men began to climb into the cart, some of them who had come by the inn foot with him, serving themselves a mile or two on the long trek home. They did not leave unrewarded. All carried burdens of a sort, boxes strapped over their shoulders, bundles under the arm, while the cobbler from Launceston had not only laden his pony with the bursting saddlebags, but had added his own person as well, being several sizes larger round the waist than he first arrived. So the wagons and carts departed from Jamaica, creaking out of the yard, one after the other in strange funeral procession, some turning north and some south when they came out into the high road, until they had all gone, and there was no one left standing in the yard but one man, Mary not seen before, the peddler, the landlord of Jamaica Inn himself. Then they too turned, and went back into the house, and the yard was empty. She heard them go along the passage in the direction of the bar, and then their footsteps died away, and the door slammed. There was no other sound except the husky wheezing of the clock in the hall, and the sudden whirring note, preparatory to the strike. It rang the hours, 3 o'clock, and then ticked on, choking and gasping like a dying man who cannot catch his breath. Mary came away from the window and sat down upon the bed. The cold air blew into her shoulders, and she shivered and reached for her shawl. The thought of sleep now was impossible. She was too wide awake, too alive in every nerve, and although the dislike and fear of her uncle was as strong as ever within her, a growing interest and curiosity held the mastery. She understood something of his business now. What she had witnessed here tonight was smuggling on the grand scale. There was no doubt that Jamaica Inn was ideally situated for this purpose, and he must have brought it for that reason alone. All that talk of returning to the home of his boyhood was nonsense, of course. The inn stood alone on the great high road that ran north and south, and Mary could see that it must be easy enough for anyone with a capacity for organization to work a team of wagons from the coast to the Tamar Bank, with the inn itself as a halting place and general store. Spies were needed about the countryside to make a success of the trade, hence the sailor from Padstow, the cobbler from Launceston, the gypsies and the tramps, and the vile little peddler. And yet, allowing for his personality, his energy, and the very fear with which his enormous physical strength must engender his companions, had Joss Merlin the necessary brain and subtlety to lead such an enterprise? Did he plan every move and every departure, and had he been making preparations for tonight's work during the past week when away from home? It must be so. Mary could see no alternative, and although her loathing for the landlord increased, she allowed herself a grudging respect for his management. The whole business must be controlled, and the agents picked for all their rough manners and wild appearance. Otherwise, the law could never have been evaded for so long. A magistrate who suspected smuggling would surely have suspected the inn before now. Unless he were an agent himself. Mary frowned, her chin in her hand. If it were not for Aunt Patience, she would walk out of the inn now and find her way to the nearest town and inform against Joss Merlin. He would soon be in jail and the rest of the rogues with him, and there would be an ending of the traffic. It was useless to reckon without Aunt Patience, however, and the fact that she was still held like a dog by devotion for her husband made the problem difficult, and at the moment impossible. Mary kept going over the question in her mind, and she was not yet satisfied that all was understood. Jamaica Inn was a nest of thieves and poachers, who, with her uncle as leader, apparently worked a profitable smuggling trade between the coast and Devon. So much was clear. But had she seen only part of the game, and was there still more for her to learn? She remembered the terror in Aunt Patience's eyes, and those words spoken for her the hush of that first afternoon, when the shadows of early twilight crept across the kitchen floor. There's things happened at Jamaica Inn, Mary, that I've never dared to breathe. Bad things, evil things, I dare not even admit them to myself. And she had climbed the staircase to her room, haunted and pale, dragging her feet like a creature old and tired. Smuggling was dangerous, it was fraught with dishonesty, it was forbidden strictly by the law of the land, but was it evil? Mary could not decide. She needed advice, and there was no one she could ask. She was alone in a grand but rather hateful world, with little prospect for changing it for the better. Had she been a man, she would have gone downstairs and challenged Joss Merslin to his face, and his friends with him. Yes, and fought them too, and drawn blood, if she were lucky. And then away on a horse from the stable, with Aunt Patience riding pillion, so down to the south again, go to the friendly Helford shore, setting up as a farmer on small way up Bogwen Bay, or Greek, and her aunt to keep house for her. While there was little use in dreaming, the present situation must be faced, and courageously too, if any good were to come of it. Here she was on her bed, a girl of 23, in a petticoat and shawl, with no weapons but her own brain to oppose a fellow twice her age and 8 times her strength, who, if he realized she had watched the scene tonight from her window, would encircle her neck with his hand, and pressing lightly with finger and thumb, put an end to her questioning. Then Mary swore, a thing she had done only once in her life before, when chased by a bullet monotony, and then it had been for the same purpose as now, to give herself courage and a certain bold pretense. I'll not show fear before Joss Merlin or any man, she said, and to prove it, I will go down now in the dark passage and take a look at them in the bar, and if it kills me, it will be my own fault. She dressed hurriedly and pulled on her stockings, leaving her shoes where they were, and then opening the door, she stood and listened for a moment, hearing nothing but slow, choking tick of the clock in the hall. She crept out into the passage and came to the stairs. By now she knew that the third step from the top creaked, and so did the last. She trod gently, one hand resting on the banister and the other against the wall to lighten her weight. And so she came to a dim hall by the entrance door, empty except for one unsteady chair in the shadowed outline of the grandfather clock. Its husky breathing sounded loud beside her ear, and it jarred upon the silence like a living thing. The hall was as black as a pit, and although she knew she was alone there, the very solitude was threatening, the closed door to the unused parlor pregnant with suggestion. The air was musty and heavy, in strange contrast to the cold stone flags that struck chill to her stockinged feet. As she hesitated, gathering courage to continue, a sudden beam of light shone into the passage that ran back at the back of the hall, and she heard voices. The door of the bar must have swung open, and someone came out, for she heard footsteps pass into the kitchen and in a few minutes return again, but whoever it was still left the door of the bar ajar. As the murmur of voices continued and the beam of light remained, Mary was tempted to climb the stairs again to her bedroom and seek safety in sleep, but at the same time there was a demon of curiosity within her that would not be stilled, and this part of her carried her through the passage beyond, and so to crouch against the walls a few paces only from the door of the bar. Her hands and her forehead were wet now with perspiration, and at first she could hear nothing but the loud beating of her heart. The door was open enough for her to see the outline of the hinged bar itself, and a collection of bottles and glasses, while directly in front along a narrow strip of floor. The splintered fragments of the glass her uncle had broken still lay where they had fallen, and beside them was a brown stain of ale spilt by some unsteady hand. The men must be sitting on the benches against the further wall, for she could not see them. They had fallen to silence, and there suddenly a man's voice rang out, quavering and high, the voice of a stranger. No, and no again, he said. I'll tell you for the final time. I'll not be party to it. I'll break with you now and forever, put an end to our agreement. That's murder you'd have me do, Mr. Merlin. There's no other name for it. It's common murder. The voice was pitched high, trembling on the final note, as though the speaker were carried away by force of its feelings and had lost command of his tongue. Someone, the landlord himself no doubt, made a reply in a low tone, and Mary could not catch his words, but his speech was broken by a cackle of laughter, and she recognized his belonging to the peddler. The quality of it was unmistakable, insulting and coarse. He must have hinted a question, for the stranger spoke again swiftly into self-defense. Swinging, is it? He said. I've risked swinging before, and I'm not afraid of my neck. No, I'm thinking of my conscience and the Almighty God, and though I'll face any man in fair fight, I'll take punishment if need be. When it comes to the killing innocent folk, and maybe women and children among them, that's going straight to hell, Joss Merlin, and you know it as well as I do. Mary heard the scraping of a chair, and a man rise to his feet, and at the same time someone thumped on the fist of his table and swore, and her uncle lifted his voice for the first time. "Not so fast, my friend," he said, "not so fast. You're stuck in this business up to your neck, and be darned to your blasted conscience. I tell you there's no go backing on it now. It's too late. It's too late for you and all of us. I've been doubtful of you for the first, with your gentleman's airs and your clean cuffs, and by God I've proved myself right. Harry, bolt the door there and put the bar across it." There was a sudden scuffle and a cry, and the sound of someone falling, and at the same time the table crashed to the floor, and the door to the yard slammed. Once more the peddler laughed, odious and obscene, and began to whistle one of his songs. "Shall we tickle him up like silly Sam?" he said, breaking off the middle. "He'd be a little body without his fine clothes. I could do with his watch and chain, too. Poor men of the road like myself haven't the money to go buy watches. Tickle him up with the whip, Joss, and let's see the color of his skin." "Shut your mouth, Harry, and do as you're told," answered the landlord. "Stand where you are by the door and prick him with your knife if he tries to pass you. Now look here, Mr. Lawyer Clerk, or whatever you are in Truro Town, you've made a fool of yourself tonight, but you're not going to make a fool of me. You'd like to walk out of that door, wouldn't you, and get on your horse and be away to Bodmin? Yes, and by 9 in the morning you'd have every magistrate in the country at the Jamaica Inn and regiment of the soldiers into the bargain. That's your fine idea, is it?" Mary could hear the stranger breathe heavily, and he must have been hurt in the scuffle, for when his voice came out it was jerky and contracted, as though he were in pain. "Do your devil's work if you must," he muttered. "I can't stop you, and I give you my word I'll not inform against you, but join you I will not, and there's my last word to you both." There was a silence, and Joss Merlin spoke again. "Have a care," he said softly. "I heard another man say that once, and 5 minutes later he was treading the air. On the end of the rope it was, my friend, and his big toe missed the floor by half an inch. I asked him if he liked to be so near the ground, but he didn't answer. The rope forced the tongue out of his mouth, and he bit it clean in half. He said afterwards they had to take it 7 3/4 minutes to die." Outside the passage, Mary felt her neck and her forehead go clammy with sweat. Their arms and legs were weighted suddenly, as though with lead. Little black specks flickered before her eyes, and with a glowing sense of horror she realized that she was probably going to faint. She had one thought in her mind, and that was to grope her way back to the deserted hall and reach the shadow of the clock. Whatever happened, she must fall there and be discovered. Mary backed away from the beam of light and felt along the wall with her hands. Her knees were shaking now, and she knew that at any moment they would give beneath her. Already a surge of sickness rose inside her, and her head was swimming. Her uncle's voice came from very far away, as though he spoke with his hands against his mouth. "Leave me alone with him, Harry," he said. "There will be no more for you tonight at Jamaica. Take his horse and be off. Cast him loose the other side of the Camelford. I'll settle this business myself." Somehow Mary found her way to the hall, and hardly conscious of what she was doing, she turned the handle of the parlor door and stumbled inside. Then she crumpled in a heap on the floor and head between her knees. She must have fainted quite away for a minute or two, because the specks in front of her eyes grouped themselves into one tremendous hole and her whirlwind black. But the position in which she had fallen brought her to herself quicker than anything else could have done, and in a moment she was sitting up, propped on one elbow, listening to the clatter of a pony's hoofs on the yard outside. She heard a voice curse to the animal to stand still. It was Harry the peddler, and he must have mounted and driven his heels into the pony's side, for the sound of the hoofs drew away and out of the yard, and disappeared in the distance down the high road, and so was lost beneath the slope of the hill. Her uncle was alone now in the bar with his victim, and Mary wondered if it would be possible for her to find her way to the nearest dwelling place on the road to Dawsbury and summon help. It meant a walk or 2 or 3 miles across the moorland track before the first shepherd's cottage was reached, and somewhere on that same track the poor idiot boy had flown earlier that evening, and was even now perhaps wailing and grimacing by the side of the ditch. She knew nothing of the inhabitants of the cottage. Possibly they belonged to her uncle's company, in which case she would be running straight into a trap. And Patience, upstairs in bed, was useless to her, and if anything, an encumbrance. It was a hopeless situation, and there seemed no way of escape for the stranger, whoever he should be, unless he himself came to the same agreement with Joss Merlin. If he had any cunning, he might be able to overpower her uncle. Now that the peddler is gone, they were evenly matched as far as numbers went, though her uncle's physical strength would tell heavily in his favor. Mary began to feel desperate. If only there were a gun somewhere, or a knife, she might be able to wound her uncle, or at least disarm him while the wretched man made his escape from the barn. She felt careless now for her own safety. It was only a matter of time anyway before she was discovered, and there was little sense in crouching here in the empty parlor. That fainting attack had been a momentary affair, and she despised herself for her weakness. She got up from the floor, and placing both hands in the latch for greater silence, she opened the door a few inches. There was not a sound in the hall but the ticking of the clock, and the beam of light in the back passage showed no more. The door of the bar must be shut. Perhaps at this moment the stranger was fighting for his life, struggling for breath in the great hands of Joss Merlin, shaken backwards and forward on the stone floor at the bar. She could hear nothing, though. Whatever work had been behind that closed door happened in silence. Mary was about to step out into the hall once more and creep past the stairs to the further passage, when a sound from above made her pause and lift her head. It was a creaking of a board. There was silence for a minute, and then it happened again, quiet footsteps pacing gently overhead. Aunt Patience slept in the further passage at the other end of the house, and Mary herself had heard Harry the peddler ride away on his pony nearly 10 minutes ago. Her uncle she knew to be in the bar with the stranger, and no one had climbed the stairs since she had descended them. There, the board creaked again, and the soft footsteps continued. Someone in the empty guest room and the floor above. Mary's heart began to thump at her side again, and her breath came quickly. Whoever was hiding above must have been there for many hours. He must have lain in waiting there since the early evening, stood behind the door when she had gone to bed. Had he gone later, she would have heard his footsteps on the stairs. Perhaps he had watched the arrival of the wagons from the window as she had done, and had seen the idiot boy run screaming down the road to Delsmere. She had been separated from him by a thin partition of wall. He must have heard her every movement, the falling onto her bed, and later her undressing and her opening of her door. Therefore he must wish to remain concealed, otherwise he would have stepped out onto the landing when she had done. Had he been one of the company in the bar, he would have spoken with her, surely. He would have questioned her movements. Who had admitted him? When could he have gone into the room? He must have hidden there so he could remain unseen by the smugglers. Therefore he was not one of them. He was an enemy to her uncle. The footfalls had ceased now, and though she held her breath and listened intently, she could hear nothing. She had not been mistaken, though. She was convinced of that. Someone, an ally perhaps, was hiding in the guest room next to hers and could help her save the stranger in the bar. She had her foot in the lowest step of the stairs, and the beam of light shone forth once more from the back passage, and she heard the door of the bar swing open. Her uncle was coming out into the hall. There was no time for Mary to climb the stairs before he turned the corner, so she was forced to step quickly back into the parlor to stand with her hand against the door. In the blackness of the hall they would never see the door that was not latched. Trembling with excitement and fear, she waited in the parlor. She had heard the landlord pass across the hall and climb the stairs to the landing above. His footsteps came to a halt above her head outside the guest room, and for a second or two he waited, as though he too listened for some alien sound. Then he tapped twice, very softly, on the door. Once more the board creaked, and someone crossed the floor of the room above. Could be no enemy to her uncle, after all. Probably Joss Merlin had admitted him in the first place, early in the evening, when she and Aunt Patience had been preparing the bar for the company, and he had lain in waiting there until all the men had departed. There were some personal friends of the landlord's, who had no wish to meddle in this evening's business, and would not show himself even to the landlord's wife. Her uncle had known him to be there all the time, and that was why he had sent this peddler away. He did not wish the peddler to see his friend. She thanked God, then, that she had not climbed the stairs and knocked on the door. Supposing that they were in her room to see if they were there and asleep, there would be little hope for her once her absence was discovered. She glanced behind her at the window. It was closed and barred. There was no road of escape. Now they were coming down from the stairs. They stopped for an instant outside the parlor door. For one moment Mary thought they were coming inside. They were so close to her that she could have touched her uncle on the shoulder through the crack of the door. As it was, he spoke, and his voice whispered right against her ear. "It's for you to say," he breathed. "It's your judgment now, not mine. I'll do it, or we'll do it between us. It's for you to say the word." Screened as she was by the door, Mary could neither see nor hear her uncle's new companion, and whatever gesture or sign made in return escaped her. They did not linger outside the parlor, but turned back along the hall to the further passage, and so down it to the bar beyond. Then the door closed, and she heard them no more. Her first instinct was to unbar the entrance and run out into the road, and so be away from them, but on reflection she realized that by doing this she would gain nothing. For all she knew, there might be other men, the peddler himself, perhaps, and the rest of them posted in intervals along the high road in anticipation of trouble. It seemed as though this new man, who had hidden all evening in the room above, could not have heard her leave the bedroom at all. Had he done so, he would have now acquainted her uncle with the fact, and they would search for her unless he dismissed her as being of no importance whatsoever in the general scheme of things. The man in the bar was their first concern. She could be attended to later. She must have stood for 10 minutes or more, waiting for some sound or signal, but everything was still. Only the clock in the hall ticked on, wheezing slowly and impervious to action, a symbol of age and indifference. Once she fancied she heard a cry, but it was gone and lost in an instant, and was so faint and afar a thing that it might have been some strange conjuring of her imagination, whipped as it was by all she had seen since midnight. Then Mary went out into the hall, and so through to the back dark passage. No crack of light came under the skirting of the door to the bar. The candles must have been extinguished. Were they sitting inside the room, all three of them, in darkness? They made an ugly picture in her mind, a silent, sinister group ruled by some purpose that she did not understand. But the very snuffling out of the light made the quietude more deadly. She ventured as far as the door and laid her ear against the panel. There was not even the murmur of a voice, nor that unmistakable suggestion of living, breathing people. The old fusty drink smell that had clung to the passage all evening had cleared, and through the keyhole came a steady draught of air. Mary gave way to a sudden uncontrollable impulse, and lifting the latch she opened the door and stepped into the room. There was nobody there. The door leading to the yard was open, and the room was filled with the fresh November air. It was this that caused the draught of the passage. The benches were empty, and the table that crashed to the ground in that first scuffle still lay upon the floor, its three legs pointing to the ceiling. The men had gone, though. They must have turned to the left outside the kitchen and walked straight on to the moor, where she would have heard them had they crossed the road. The air felt cold and sweet upon her face, and now that her uncle and the strangers had left it, the room seemed harmless and impersonal once more. The horror was spent. At last, a little ray of moonlight made a white circle on the floor, and into the circle moved a dark blob like a finger. It was the reflection of a shadow. Mary looked up to the ceiling and saw that a rope had been slung through a hook in the beam. It was the rope's end that made the blob in the white circle, and it kept moving backwards and forwards, blown by the draught from the open door. As the days passed, Mary Yellen settled down to life at Jamaica Inn with a sense of stubborn resolution. It was evident that she could not leave her aunt to face the winter alone, but perhaps with the coming of spring, Patience Merlin could be persuaded to see reason, and the pair of them would leave the moors for peace and quietude of Helford Valley. This was at any rate Mary's hope, and meanwhile she must make the best of her grim 6 months that lay ahead, and if possible she was determined to have the better of her uncle in the long run, and expose him and his confederates to the law. She would have shrugged her shoulders at the smuggling alone, though the flagrant dishonesty of the trade disgusted her, but all she had seen so far went to prove Joss Merlin and his friends were not content with this only. They were desperate men, afraid of nothing and no one, and did not stop at murder. The events that first Saturday night, were never far from her mind, and the straggling rope's end hanging from the beam told its own tale. Mary had no doubt that the stranger had been killed by her uncle and another man, and his body buried somewhere in the moors. There was nothing to prove it, however, and considered in the light of day, the very story seemed fantastic. She had returned to her room that night, and the discovery of the rope for the open door of the bar suggested that her uncle would be back at any moment. And exhausted with all she had seen, she must have fallen asleep, for when she woke the sun was high, and she could hear Aunt Patience pattering about in the hall below. No sign remained of the evening's work, for the bar had been swept and tidied, and the furniture replaced and the broken glass taken away, and there was no rope hanging from the beam. The landlord himself spent the morning in the stable in the cow house, pitchforking filth into the yard, and doing work that a cowman should have done had he kept one, and when he came into the kitchen at midday to wolf an enormous meal, he questioned Mary about the farm stock at Helford, and asked her opinion on a calf that had fallen sick, nor did he make any reference to the events of the preceding night. He seemed in a fair good humor, and went so far as to forget to curse his wife, who hovered around him as usual, watching the expression in his eye like a dog who would please his master. Joss Merlin behaved like a perfectly sober, normal man, and it was impossible to believe that he had murdered a fellow being only a few hours before. He might be guiltless of this, of course, and the blame rest upon his unknown companion, but at least Mary had seen him with her own eyes chase the naked idiot boy across the yard, and she had heard the boy scream as he felt the lash of the landlord's whip. She had seen him ringleader of that vile company at the bar. She had heard him threaten the stranger who opposed his will, and here he sat before her now, his mouth full of hot stew, shaking his head over a sick calf, and she answered yes and no in reply to her uncle, drank down her tea, watching him over the brim of her cup, her eyes traveling from his great plate of steaming stew to his long, powerful fingers, hideous in their strength and grace. 2 weeks went by, and there was no repetition of Saturday night. Perhaps the last haul had satisfied the landlord and his companions, and they were content with that for a while, for Mary did not hear the wagons again, and though she was sleeping soundly now, she was certain that the noise of wheels would have woken her. Her uncle appeared to have no objection to know more of the surrounding country, stumbling upon tracks that she had not noticed at first and which kept her to the high ground, leading ultimately to the tors, while she learned to avoid the low soggy grass with tufted tops that by their very harmless appearance invited inspection, only to reveal themselves as the borderline of treacherous and dangerous marsh. Though lonely, she was not actively unhappy, and these rambles in the grey light of early afternoon kept her healthy at least, and went some way towards tempering the gloom and depression of the long dark evenings at Jamaica, when Aunt Patience sat with her hands in her lap, staring at the turf fire, and Joss Merlin shut himself up alone in the bar and disappeared on the back of his pony to some unknown destination. Companionship there was none, and no one came to the inn for rest or nourishment. The driver of the coach had spoken truth when he told Mary they never stopped now at Jamaica, for she would stand out in the yard to watch the coaches pass twice in the week, and they were gone by it in a moment, rumbling down the hill and climbing further one towards 5 lanes, without drawing rein or pausing for breath. Once Mary waved her hand as she recognized her driver, but she took no notice of her, only whipping his horses harder. She realized with a rather helpless sense of futility that so far as other people were concerned she must be considered in the same light as her uncle, and that even if she tried to walk to Bowden or Launceston, no one would receive her, and the doors would be shut in her face. The future loomed very black at times, especially as Aunt Patience made little effort to be companionable, and though now and again she took hold of Mary's hand and patted it for a few minutes, telling her how glad she was to have her in the house, for the most part the poor woman existed in a dream, pottering about her household duties in a mechanical fashion and seldom uttering. When she did speak, it was to let forth a torrent of nonsense about the great man her husband might have been had not ill luck constantly followed him. Any normal conversation was practically impossible, and Mary came to humour her and talk gently as she would have done to a child, all of which was a strain on her nerves and on her patience. So that it was in a mood of truculence following upon a day of wind and rain that had made it impractical to venture out of doors, as Mary one morning set herself clean down the long stone passage that ran the full width of the back of the house. The hard work, if it strengthened her muscles, did not improve her temper, that for very little she would have walked out into the patch of garden behind the kitchen, where her uncle was working, heedless of the rain upon his mat of hair, and thrown her bucket of dirty soapy water into his very face. The sight of her aunt, who with bent back poked at the dull peat fire with the end of a stick, defeated her, and Mary was about to start at the stone flags of the entrance hall, when she heard a clatter of hoofs in the yard, and in a moment someone thundered on the closed door of the bar. No one had approached Jamaica Inn before, and this summons was an event in itself. Mary went back to the kitchen to warn her aunt, but she had left the room, and looking out of the window, Mary could see her pattering across the garden to her husband, who was loading turf in the sack of the barrow. They were both out of earshot, and neither could be heard to the sound of this new arrival. Mary wiped her hands on her apron and went to the bar. The door must have been unlocked after all, and for her surprise, there was a man sitting straddle-legged across the chair, with a glass in his hand filled to the brim with ale, which he had calmly poured out from a tap himself. For a few minutes they considered one another in silence. Something about him was familiar, and Mary wondered where she had seen him before. The rather drooping lids, the curve of his mouth, the outline of his jaw, even the bold and decidedly insolent stare with which he favored her, were things known to her and definitely disliked. The sight of him looking her up and down and drinking his ale at the same time irritated her beyond measure. "What do you think you're doing?" she said sharply. "You haven't any right to walk in here and help yourself. Besides, the landlord doesn't encourage strangers." At any other moment she would have laughed to herself to speak thus, as though in defence of her uncle, but scrubbing the stone flags had done away with her sense of humour, if only for the moment, and she felt she must vent her ill temper on the nearest victim. The man finished his ale and held out the glass to be refilled. "Since when have they kept a barmaid at Jamaica Inn?" he asked her, and feeling in his pocket for a pipe, he lit it, puffing a great cloud of smoke into her face. His manner infuriated Mary, and she leaned forward and pulled the pipe out of his hand. Throwing it behind her onto the floor where it smashed at once, he shrugged his shoulders and began to whistle, the very uneasiness adding fuel to the flame of irritation. "Is this how they train you to serve customers?" he said, breaking off in the middle. "I don't think much of their choice. There are better men are made in Launceston, where I was yesterday, and pretty as paint to the bargain. What have you been doing to yourself? Your hair is coming down at the back, your face is none too clean." Mary turned away and walked toward the door, and he called her back. "Fill up my glass, that's what you're here for, isn't it?" he said. "I've ridden 12 miles since breakfast, and I'm thirsty." "You may have ridden 50 miles, for all I care," said Mary, "and you seem to know your way about here. You can fill your own glass. I'll tell Mr. Merlin you are in the bar, and he can serve you himself if he has the mind." "Oh, don't worry, Joss. He'll be like a bear with a sore head at this time of day," came the answer. "Besides, he's never very anxious to see me. What's happened to his wife? Has he turned her out to make room for you? I call that hard on the poor woman. You'll never stay with him 10 years, anyway. Miss Merlin is in the garden if you want to see her," said Mary. "You can walk out of the door and turn to the left, and you'll come to the patch of garden where the chicken run. And both of them are down under 5 minutes ago. You can't come through this way because I've just washed the passage, and I don't want to do it all over again." "Oh, don't get excited. There's plenty of time," he replied. She could see he was still looking her up and down, wondering what to make of her, and familiar, somewhat lazy insolence his eyes maddened her. "Do you want to speak to the landlord or not?" she asked at length. "Because I can't stand here all day waiting your pleasure. If you don't want to see him, and you've finished your drink, you can put down your money on the counter and go away." The man laughed, and his smile and a flash of teeth struck out a chord in her memory, but still she could not name the resemblance. "Do you order Joss about in this way?" he said. "He must be a changed man if you do. What a creature of contradictions the fellow is, after all. I never thought he'd run a young woman alongside his other activities. What do you do with that poor Patience of an evening? Do you turn her out on the floor, or do you sleep with all three abreast?" Mary flushed scarlet. "Joss Merlin is my uncle by marriage," she said, "and Patience was my mother's only sister. My name is Mary Gallen, if that means anything to you. Good morning. There's the door behind you." She left the bar and walked into the kitchen, straight into the arms of the landlord himself. "Who in H's name are you talking to in the bar?" he thundered. "I thought I'd warned you to keep your mouth shut." The loudness of his voice echoed in the passage. "All right," called the man from the bar. "Don't beat her. She's broken my pipe and refused to serve me. That sounds like your training, doesn't it? Come in and let's have a look at you. I'm hoping this maid has done you some good." Joss Merlin frowned, and pushing Mary aside, he stepped into the bar. "Oh, it's you, Jim, is it?" he said. "What do you want at Jamaica today? I can't buy a horse from you, if that's what you're after. Things are going badly, and I'm as poor as a field mouse after a wet harvest." He closed the door, leaving Mary in the passage outside. She went back to her bucket of water in the front hall, wiping the dirty mark from her face with her apron. So that was Jim Merlin, her uncle's younger brother. Of course, she had seen the resemblance all the time, and like a fool, had not been able to place it. He had reminded her of her uncle throughout the conversation, and she had not realized it. He had Joss Merlin's eyes without the blood-flecked lines and without the pouches, and he had Joss Merlin's mouth, firm, though, where the landlord's was weak, and narrow where his lower lip sagged. He was what Joss Merlin might have been 18-20 years ago, but smaller in build and height, neater in person. Mary splashed the water into the stone flags and began to scrub furiously, her lips pressed tight together. What a vile breed they were, then, these Merlins, with their studied insolence and coarseness, their rough brutality of manner. This Jim had the same streak of cruelty as his brother, and she could see it in the shape of his mouth. Aunt Patience had said was the worst of the family. Although he was a head and shoulders smaller than Joss and half the breadth, there was a certain strength about him that the elder brother did not possess. He looked hard and keen. The landlord sagged around the chin, and his shoulders weighed on him like a burden. It was as though his power had wasted in some way and had run to seed. Drink did that to a man, Mary knew, and for the first time she was able to guess something of the wreck that Joss Merlin had become in comparison to his younger former self. It was seeing his brother that had shown her. The landlord had betrayed himself. If the younger one had any sense in his head, he would pull himself together before he traveled the same road. Perhaps he did not care, though. There must be a fatality about the Merlin family that did away with striving forward and making good in life and resolution. Their record was too black. "There's no going against bad blood," his mother used to say. "It always comes out in the end. You may fight it as much as you like, but it will have the better of you. If 2 generations live clean, that may steer clear the stream sometimes, but likely as not the third will break out and start it going again. What a waste it all was, what a waste and a pity. And here is poor Aunt Patience dragged in the current with the Merlins, all her youth and gaiety gone before her, leaving her, if the truth be faced, very little superior to the idiot boy at Dozmary, and Aunt Patience might have been a farmer's wife at Quack, with sons of her own, and a house and a land, and all the little happy trivialities of a normal life, gossip with the neighbors, church on Sundays, driving to the market once a week, fruit picking and harvest time, things she would have loved, things that had foundation. She would have known placidity. There would be tranquil years that turned her hair in time to gray, years of solid work and calm enjoyment. All this promise she had thrown away, to live like a slattern with a brute and a drunkard. Why were women such fools, so short-sighted and unwise, wondered Mary, and she struck the last stone flag of the hall with venom, as though by her very action she would cleanse the world and blot out the indiscretions of her kind. She had worked up her energy to a frenzy, and turning from the hall, proceeded to sweep the gloomy, dim parlor that had not seen a broom for years. A cloud of dust met her face, and she beat savagely at the wretched, threadbare mat. She was so absorbed in her disagreeable occupation that she did not hear the stone flung at the window of the parlor, and it was not until a shower of pebbles made a crack in the glass that her concentration was disturbed, and looking out of the window she saw Jim Merlin standing in the yard beside his pony. Mary frowned at him and turned away, but he made answer with another shower of pebbles, this time cracking the glass in earnest so that a small piece of the pane slithered onto the floor, with a stone beside it. Mary unbolted the heavy entrance door and went out into the porch. "What do you want now?" she asked him, conscious suddenly of her loose hair and rumpled, dirty apron. He still looked down at her with curiosity, but insolence had gone, and he had the grace to appear the smallest bit ashamed of himself. "Forgive me if I was rude to you just now," he said. "Somehow I didn't expect to see a woman at Jamaica Inn. Not a young girl like you, anyway. I thought Joss had found you in one of the towns and had brought you back here for his fancy lady." Mary flushed again, and he bit her lip in annoyance. "There's nothing very fanciful about me," she said scornfully. "I'd look well in a town, wouldn't I, in my old apron and heavy shoes? I should have thought anyone with eyes in his head could see that I was farm-bred." "Oh, I don't know," he said carelessly. "Put you in a fine gown with a pair of high-heeled shoes and a stick of comb in your hair, and I dare say you'd pass for a lady even in a big place like Exeter." "I meant to be flattered by that, I suppose," said Mary, "but thanking you very much. I'd rather wear my old clothes and look like myself." "You could do a lot worse than that, of course," he agreed, and looking up he saw that she was still laughing at her. She turned to go back into the house. "Come, don't go away," he said. "I know I deserve black looks for speaking to you as I did, but if you knew my brother as well as I do, you'd understand me making the mistake. It looks strange having a maid at Jamaica Inn. Why did you come here in the first place?" Mary considered him from the shadow of the porch. He looked serious now, and like his likeness to Joss had fled for a moment. She wished he were not a Merlin. "I came here to be with my Aunt Patience," she said. "My mother died some weeks ago, and I have no other relative. I'll tell you one thing, Mr. Merlin. I'm thankful my mother isn't allowed to see her sister now. I don't suppose marriage with Joss is a bed of roses," he said to his brother. "He always had the temper of the devil himself, and he drinks like a fish. What did she marry him for? He's been the same as long as I can remember. He used to trust me when I was a lad, and he'd do the same today if he dared." "I suppose she was misled by his bright eyes," said Mary scornfully. "Aunt Patience was always the butterfly down in Helford, Mother used to say. She wouldn't have a farmer who asked her, but took herself off a country when she met your brother. That was the worst day in her life, anyway." "You've not much opinion of the landlord, then," he said, mocking her. "No, I have not," she replied. "He's a bully and a brute, and many worse things beside. He's turned my aunt from a laughing, happy woman into a miserable drudge, and I'll never forgive him for that for as long as I live." Jim whistled tunelessly and patted his horse's neck. "We Merlins have never been good to our women," he said. "I can remember my father beating my mother till she couldn't stand. She never left him, though, but stood by him all his life. When he was hanged at Exeter, she didn't speak to a soul for 3 months. Her hair went white with the shock. I can't remember my grandmother, but they say she fought side by side with a granddad once near Callington, when the soldiers came to take him, and she bit a fellow's finger right through to the bone. What she said to love in a granddad I can't say, for he never as much as asked for her after he'd been taken, and he left all his savings to with another woman the other side of Tamar." Mary was silent. The indifference in his voice appalled her. He spoke entirely without shame or regret, and she supposed that he had been born like the rest of his family, lacking quality or tenderness. How long do you mean to stay at Jamaica? He asked abruptly. It's a waste for a maid like you, isn't it? There's not much company for you here. I can't help that, said Mary. I'm not going away unless I take my auntie with me. I'd never leave her here alone, not after what I've seen. Jim bent down to brush a piece of dirt from his pony's shoe. What have you learned in your short time? He questioned. It's quiet enough here, in all conscience. Mary was not easily led. For all she knew, her uncle had prompted his brother to speak to her, hoping that in this way to obtain information. No, she was not quite such a fool as that. She shrugged her shoulders, dismissing the subject. I helped my uncle in the bar Saturday night, she said, and I did not think much of the company he kept. I don't suppose you did, said Jim. The fellows who come to Jamaica have never been taught manners. They spend too much time in the country jail. I wonder what they thought of you. Make the same mistake as I did, I suppose, and they are now spreading your fame far and wide about the countryside. You'll have Joss throwing dice for you next time, I dare say, and when he loses you'll find yourself riding pillion behind a dirty poacher from the other side of Rufton. There's not much likelihood of that, said Mary. They'd have to knock me senseless before I'd rode pillion with anyone. Senseless or unconscious women are pretty much the same when you come down to it, said Jim. The poachers on Bowman Moor would never know the difference anyway. Asked Mary in sudden curiosity, for during their conversation she became aware that he spoke better than his brother. I'm a horse thief, he said pleasantly, but there's not much money in it, really. My pockets are always empty. You ought to ride here. I've got a pretty little pony that'll suit you handsomely. He's over at Tarwatha now. Why don't you come back with me and look at him? Aren't you afraid of being caught? Said Mary. Thieving is an awkward thing to prove, he told her. Supposing a pony strays from his pen, and his owner goes to look for him. Well, you've seen for yourself, these moors are alive with wild horses and cattle. It's not going to be so easy for that owner to find his pony. Say the pony had a long name, and one light foot, and a diamond mark at his ear. That narrows the field down a bit, doesn't it? And off goes the owner to Launceston fair with his eyes wide open. But he doesn't find his pony, Marky. The pony is there, right enough, and he's bought some dealer and sold up away country. Only his mane is clipped, his 4 feet are all the same color, and the mark at his ear is a slit, nor a diamond. The owner didn't even look at him twice. That's simple enough, isn't it? So simple that I can't understand why you don't ride past Jamaica in your coach, with a powdered foot and an step, said Mary swiftly. Ah, well, there you are, he said, shaking his head. I've never had the brain for figures. You'd be surprised to learn how quickly money slips through my fingers. Do you know, I had 10 pounds in my pocket last week. I've only a shilling piece today. That's why I want you to buy my little pony. Mary laughed in spite of herself. He was so frank in his dishonesty that she had not the heart to be angry with him. I can't spend my small savings on horses, she said. I'm laying aside for my old age, and if I ever get away from Jamaica, I shall need every penny. You may depend on that. Jim Merlin looked at her gravely, and then, on a sudden impulse, he bent towards her, first glancing over her head into the porch beyond. Look here, he said. I'm serious now. You can forget all the nonsense I've told you. Jamaica is no place for a maid, nor for any woman, if it comes to that. My brother and I have never been friends, and I can say that I like about him. We go our own ways, and be darned to one another, but there's no reason why you should be caught up in this dirty schemes. Why don't you run away? I'd see you on the road in Bowman, all right. His tones were persuasive, and Mary could almost have trusted him, but she could not forget he was Joss Marlin's brother, and as much as she might betray her, she dared not make a confidant of him, not yet anyway. Time would show whose side he was on. I don't need any help, she said. I can look after myself. Jim threw his leg over the pony's back and stuck to his feet to the heathers. All right, he said, I won't worry you. My cottage is across Withybook, if you ever want me. The other side of Tarwatha Marsh, at the foot of Twelman's Moor. I shall be there during the spring, anyway. Good day to you. And he was off and away down the road before she had time to say a word in return. Mary went slowly back into the house. She would have trusted him had his name been any other than Merlin. She was in urgent need of a friend, but she could not make a friend of the landlord's brother. He was no more than a common horse thief, a dishonest scoundrel. When all was said and done, he was little better than Harry the peddler and the rest of them. Because he had a disarming smile and his voice was not unpleasing, she had been ready to believe him, and he had all the time, perhaps, laughing at her on the other side of his face. There was bad blood in him, and he broke the law every day of its life, and whatever way she looked at it, there was no escaping from that one unredeemable fact. He was Joss Merlin's brother. He had said there was no bond between them, but even that might be a lie to enlist her sympathy. while the whole of their conversation perhaps had been prompted by the landlord in the bar. No, whatever happened, she must stand alone in this business and trust no one. The very walls of Jamaica Inn smelt of guilt and deceit, and to speak aloud in earshot of the building courted disaster. It was dark in the house and quiet once more. The landlord had returned to the peat stack at the bottom of the garden, and Aunt Patience was in her garden kitchen. The surprise of the visit had been a little excitement and breaking up of the long monotonous day. Jean Merlin had brought something of the outer world with him, a world that was not entirely bounded by the moors and frowned upon by the towers of granite, and now that he had departed, the early brightness of the day went with him. The sky became overcast, and the inevitable rain came sweeping from the west, topping the hills in mist. The black leather bowed before the wind. The ill temper that had fastened upon Mary, at the beginning of the morning, had passed away, and in its place had stolen a numb indifference born of fatigue and despair. Interminably the days and weeks stretched themselves before her, with no other sight but the long white road to tempt her, the stone walls, and the everlasting hills. She thought of Jim Merlin, riding away with the song on his lips, kicking to his heel into his pony's side, and he would ride hatless, careless of the wind and the rain, choosing his own road. She thought of the lane that led to Helford village, how it twisted and turned and wound suddenly to the water's edge, while the ducks paddled in the mud before the turn of the tide, and a man called to his cows from the field above. All those things were progressive in parts of life, and they were their way without a thought of her. But she was bound here by a promise that she must not break, and the very patter of Aunt Patience's feet as she passed to and fro in the kitchen was a reminder and a warning. Mary watched the little stinging rain blur the glass of the parlor window, and as she sat there alone with her chin in her hand, the tears ran down her cheeks in company with the rain. She let them fall, too indifferent to wipe them away with the draught of the door, for she had forgotten to close the ruffled, a long torn strip of the paper on the wall. There had once been a rose pattern, but it was now faded and gray, and the walls themselves were stained deep brown where the damp had turned them. Mary turned away from the window, and the cold, dead atmosphere of Jamaica Inn closed in upon her. Oops. I'm thinking maybe I should stop to drink a nice hot beverage before I continue reading. Yeah, this book is really fantastic. I think actually this might only be my second time reading it, but I thought it was really good. It was very memorable, and I think really the thing about this book is that it's like it's kind of like a sort of warning for when you want to do good in someone's life who has chosen so much trouble. Like sometimes you can't save people out of things. And I don't want to spoil the book by saying that, but I think that's like really the biggest takeaway from the book, or one of, like, is that it's the thing of like, she's very much like this strong-willed character, and that's what really makes her so unique in all this, is that, like, she's not going to waste time feeling sorry for herself. She's going to, like, do what she can and take the action she can. But even doing so, there's still some more that she has to kind of, like, experience, go through, for her to really mature and realize a few things. But it's also interesting to me too how, as the story progresses, she starts to really see, like, as she's maturing, how easy it would be for her to be, like, swept away by someone who's, like, daring and mischievous, like Jim, because, like, she starts to see how it might have been for her, and um but I mean, also, so it's like she slowly, and that too, like, the thing of, some of, I don't want to spoil the book for anyone who hasn't read it, but it's also just a book about being careful of what you think based on appearances or first impressions, and um, who you can trust and who you can't trust, and who turns out to be, anyway, trustworthy. It's a fantastic book. I think I just need to get something warm to drink or something. I'm down the stairs, and I'll come back. I'll be right back. I had coffee, but then I had really bad allergies, and I had to drink something else. So I chose ginger lemon tea. I'll be right back. Mom? 6. That night the wagons came again. Mary woke to the sound of the hall clock striking 2, and almost at once she was aware of footsteps beneath the porch, and she heard a voice speak, soft and low. She crept out of bed and went over to the window. Yes, there they were. Only 2 carts this time, with 1 horse in the harness, and the other, and less of half a dozen men standing in the yard. The wagons looked ghostly in the dim light, like hearses, and the men themselves were phantom figures having no place in the world day by day, but moving silently about the yard as some weird pattern in the nightmare of fantasy. There was something horrible about them, something sinister in the shrouded wagons themselves, coming as they did, in stealth by night. This night, the impression they left upon Mary was even more lasting and profound, for now she understood the significance of their trade. They were desperate men who worked this road and carried convoys to Jamaica, and the last time they brought their wagons to the yard, one of their number had been murdered. Perhaps tonight yet another crime would be committed, and the twisted length of rope dangle once again from the beam below. The scene in the yard held a fatal fascination. And Mary could not leave the window. This time the wagons had arrived empty, and were loaded with the remainder of the cargo deposited at the inn the time before. Mary guessed that this was their method of working. The inn served as a store for a few weeks at a time, and then when opportunity occurred, the wagons set forth once more, and the cargo was carried to the Tamar Bank and distributed. The organization must be one big to cover the ground in time, and there would be agents scattered far and wide to keep the necessary watch on events. Perhaps there were hundreds implicated in the trade in the Penzance and St. Ives in the south of the Lawrence border of Devon. There had been little talk of smuggling in Helford, and there had been, it was the wink with the smile of indulgence, as though a pipe of baccy and a bottle of brandy from a ship of Falmouth port was an occasional harmless luxury, and not a burden on any person's conscience. This was different, though. There was a grim business to stir and a bloody business, and the precious light little smiling or winking went with it, from all that Mary had seen. If this conscience picked a man, he received a rope around his neck in payment. There must be no weak link in the chain that stretched from coast up to the border, and there was the explanation of the rope on the beam. The stranger had demurred, and the stranger had died. It was with a sudden string of disappointment that Mary wondered whether the visit of Jim Berlin to Jamaica Inn this morning had significance. A strange coincidence that the wagons should follow in his train. He had come from Launceston, he said, and Launceston stood on the Tamar Bank. Mary was angry with him and with herself. In spite of everything, her last thought before sleeping had been the possibility of his friendship. She would be a fool if she had hopes of it now. The 2 events ran together in an unmistakable fashion, and it was easy enough to read the purpose of it. Jim might disagree with his brother, but they were both in the same trade. He had ridden to Jamaica to warn the landlord that he might expect the convoy in the evening. It was simple enough to understand, and then having something of a heart, he had advised Mary to take herself to Bodmin. There was no place for a maid, he said. No one knew that better than he did himself, being one of the company. It was a wretched, damnable business in every way, but a ray of hope in any direction, and there she was in the midst of it all, with 8 patients like a child on her hands. Now the 2 wagons were loaded, and the drivers climbed in their seats with their companions. The performance had not been a lengthy one tonight. Mary could see the great head and shoulders of her uncle on a level with the porch, and he held a lantern in his hand, the light dimmed by a shutter. Then the carts rumbled out of the yard and turned to the left, as Mary had expected, and so in the direction of Launceston. She came away from the window and climbed back into bed. Presently she heard her uncle's footsteps on the stairs, and he went along the further passage to his bedroom. There was no one hiding in the guest room tonight. The next few days passed without incident, and the only vehicle on the road was the coach of Launceston, rumbling past Jamaica like a sacred black beetle. There came a fine crisp morning with frost on the ground, and for once the sun shone in a cloudless sky. The tour stood out boldly against the hard blue heaven, and the moorland grass, usually soggy and brown, glistened stiff and white with the frost. The drinking well in the yard had a thin layer of ice, the mud had hardened where the crows had trodden, and the marks of their feet were preserved and formed ridges that would not yield until the next fall of rain. The light wind came singing from the northeast, and it was cold. Mary, whose spirits always rose at the sight of the sun, had turned her morning into washing day, and with sleeves rolled well above the elbows, plunged her arms into the tub, the hot soapy water bubbling with froth, caressing her skin in exquisite contrast to the sharp, stinging air. She felt well in being, and she sang as she worked. Her uncle had ridden away on the moor somewhere, and a sense of freedom possessed her while he was gone. At the back here she was sheltered somewhat from the wind, the broad sturdy house acting as a screen, and as she wrung out her linen and spread it on the stunted gorse bush, she saw that the full force of the sun fell upon it, and it would be dry by noon. An urgent tapping on the window made her look up, and she saw Aunt Patience beckon to her, very white in the face and evidently frightened. Mary wiped her hands on her apron and ran back to the door of the house. No sooner had she entered the kitchen than her aunt seized upon her with trembling hands and began to blabber incoherently. Quietly, quietly, said Mary. I cannot understand what you're saying. Here, take this chair and sit down and drink this glass of water for mercy's sake. Now, what is it? The poor woman rocked backwards and forwards in her chair, her mouth working nervously, and she kept jerking her head towards the door. It's Mr. Bassett from North Hill, she whispered. I saw him from the parlor window. He's come on horseback and another gentleman with him. Oh, my dear, what are we going to do? Even as she spoke, there was a loud knock at the entrance door, and then a pause, followed by a thunder of blows. Aunt Patience groaned aloud, biting the ends of her fingers and tearing at her nails. Why has he come here? She cried. He's never been before. He's always kept away. He's heard something. I know he has. Oh, Mary, what are we going to do? What are we going to say? Mary thought quickly. She was in a very difficult position. If this was Mr. Bassett, and he represented the law, it was her one chance of betraying her uncle. She could tell him of the wagons and all she had seen since her arrival. She looked down at the trembling woman at her side. Mary, Mary, for the sake of the dear Lord, tell me what I am to say, she pleaded in patience, and she took her niece's hand and held it to her heart. The hammering on her door was incessant now. Listen to me, said Mary. We shall have to let him in or he'll break down the door. Pull yourself together now. There's no need to say anything at all. Say Uncle Joss is away from home and you know nothing, and I'll come with you. The woman looked at her with haggard, desperate eyes. Mary, she said, if Mr. Bassett asks you what you know, you won't answer him, will you? I can trust you, can't I? You'll not tell him of the wagons. If any danger came to Joss, I'd kill myself, Mary. There was no argument after that. Mary would lie herself into hell rather than let her aunt suffer. The situation must be faced, though, however ironical her position to be. Come with me to the door, she said. We'll not keep Mr. Bassett long. You needn't be afraid of me. I shall say nothing. They went into the hall together, and Mary unbolted the heavy entrance door. There were two men outside the porch. One had dismounted, and it was he who had rained blows on the door. The other was a big burly fellow, in a heavy top coat and cape, seated on the back of a chestnut horse. His hat was pulled square over his eyes, but Mary could see that his face was heavily lined and weather-beaten, and she judged him to be somewhere about 50 years of age. You take your time here, don't you? He called. There doesn't seem to be much of a welcome for travelers. Is the landlord at home? Patience Merlin poked at her niece with her hand, and Mary made answer. Mr. Merlin is from home, sir, she said. Are you in need of refreshment? I will serve you if you will go through the bar. Darned refreshment, he returned. I know better than to come to Jamaica Inn for that. I want to speak to your master. Here, you are the landlord's wife. When do you expect him home? Aunt Patience gave him a little curtsy. If you please, Mr. Bassett, she said, speaking unnaturally loudly and clearly, like a child who has learned a lesson. My husband went out as soon as he had his breakfast, and whether he will be back before nightfall, I really cannot say. Growled the squire. That's a darned nuisance. I wanted a word or two with Mr. Joss Merlin. Now look here, my good woman, your precious husband may have bought Jamaica Inn behind my back, in his blackguardly fashion, but we'll not go into that again now. But one thing I won't stand for, and that's having all my land hereabouts made a byword for everything that's darnable and dishonest round the countryside. I'm sure I don't know what you mean, Mr. Bassett, said Aunt Patience, working her mouth and twisting her hands in her dress. We live very quietly here, indeed we do. My niece here will tell you the same. Oh, come, I'm not such a fool as that, answered the squire. I've had my eye on this place for a long while. A house doesn't get a bad name without reason, Miss Merlin. And Jamaica instinks from here to the coast. Don't you pretend to me here, Richards. Hold my confounded horse, will you? The other man, who by this dress appeared to be a servant, held the bridle, and Mr. Bassett climbed heavily to the ground. While I'm here I may as well look around, he said, and I'll tell you here and now that it's useless to refuse me. I'm a magistrate, and I have a warrant. He pushed his way past the two women, and so through to the little entrance hall. Aunt Patience made a movement to go as though to deter him, but Mary shook her head and frowned. Let him go, she murmured. If we try to stop him now, we shall only anger him the more. Mr. Bassett was looking about him in disgust. Good God, he exclaimed. The place smells like a tomb. What in the world have you done to it? Jamaica Inn was always rough cast and plain, and fair homely, but this is a positive disgrace. Why, the place is a bare as cupboard. You haven't a stick of furniture. He had thrown open the door of the parlor and pointed to the damp walls with a crop. You have the roof about your ears if you don't stop that, he said. I've never seen such a thing in my life. Go on, Miss Merlin. Lead the way upstairs, pale and anxious. Patience Merlin turned to the staircase, her eyes searching those of her niece for reassurance. The rooms on the landing were thoroughly explored. The squire peered into the dusty corners, lifted the old sacks, and prodded the potatoes, all the while uttering exclamations of anger and disgust. Call this an inn, do you? He said. Why, you haven't even a bed to sleep a cat. The place is rotten right through. What's the idea, eh? Have you lost your tongue, Miss Merlin? The poor woman was past replying. She kept shaking her head and working her mouth, and Mary knew that both she and her aunt were wondering what would happen when they came to the guard room in the passage below. The landlord's lady appears to be momentarily deaf and dumb, said the squire dryly. What about you, young woman? Have you anything to say? I've only lately come to stay here, replied Mary. My mother died, and I'm here to look after my aunt. She's not very strong. You can see that for yourself. She's nervous and easily upset. I don't blame her living in a place like this, said Mr. Bassett. Well, there's nothing more to see up here. So you'll kindly take me downstairs again and show me the room that is barred windows. I noticed it from the yard, and I'd like to see inside. Aunt Patience passed her tongue over her lips and looked at Mary. She was incapable of speech. I'm very sorry, sir, Mary replied, but if you mean the old lumber room at the end of the passage, I'm afraid the door is locked. My uncle always keeps the key. Where he puts it, I don't know. The squire looked from one to the other in suspicion. What about you, Miss Merlin? Don't you know where your husband keeps his keys? Aunt Patience shook her head. The squire snorted and turned on his heel. Well, that's easily settled, he said. We'll have the door down in no time. And he went out into the yard to call the servant. Mary patted her aunt's hand and drew her close. Try not to tremble so, she whispered fiercely. Anyone can see you have something to hide. Your only chance is to pretend you don't mind, and he can see anything in the house for all you care. In a few minutes, Mr. Bassett returned with the man Richards, who, grinning all over his face at the thought of destruction, carried an old bar like he had found in the stable, which he evidently intended on using as a battering ram. If it had not been for her aunt, Mary would have given herself to the scene with some enjoyment. For the first time she would be permitted a view of the barred room. The fact that her aunt, and herself too for that matter, would be implicated in any discovery that was made caused her mixed feelings. However, for the first time she realized it was going to be a very difficult task to prove their complete and thorough innocence. No one was likely to believe protestations, with Aunt Patience fighting blindly on the landlord's side. It was with some excitement then that Mary watched Mr. Bassett and his servant seize the bar between them and ram it against the lock of the door. For a few minutes it withstood them, and the sound of the blows echoed through the house. Then there was a splintering of wood and a crash, and the door gave way before them, Aunt Patience uttered a little cry of distress, and the squire pushed past her into the room. Richards leaned on a bar, wiping the sweat from his forehead, and Mary could see through to the room over his shoulder. It was dark, of course. The barred windows with their lining of sack kept the light from penetrating the room. "Give me a candle, one of you," shouted the squire. "It's as black as a pit in here." The servant produced a stump of candle from his pocket, and a light was kindled. He handed the candle to the squire, who, lifting it high above his head, stepped into the center of the room. For a moment there was a silence, and the squire turned, letting the light shine in every corner, and then, clicking his tongue in annoyance and disappointment, he faced the little group behind them. "Nothing," he said, "absolutely nothing. The landlord has made me a fool of me again. Except for a pile of sacks in one corner of the room was completely empty. It was thick with dust, and there were cobwebs on the walls larger than a man's hand. There was no furniture of the sort, and the hearth had been blocked up with stones, and the floor itself was flagged like the passage outside. On the top of the sacks lay a length of twisted rope." Then the squire shrugged his shoulders and turned once more into the passage. "Well, Mr. Joss Merlin has won this time," he said. "There's not enough evidence in that room to kill a cat. I'd admit myself beaten." The two women followed him to the outer hall, and so to the porch, while the servant made his way to the stable to fetch the horses. Mr. Bassett flicked his boot with his whip and stared moodily in front of him. "You've been lucky, Miss Merlin," he said. "If I'd found what I expected to find in that blasted room of yours, this time tomorrow your husband would be in the county jail. As it is," once more he clicked his tongue in annoyance, and broke off in the middle of his sentence. "Stir yourself, Richards, can't you?" he shouted. "I can't afford to waste any more of my morning. What are you doing?" The man appeared at the stable door, leading the two horses behind him. "Now listen to me, Mr. Bassett," pointing his crop at Mary. "This aunt of yours may have lost her tongue and her senses with them, but you can understand plain English, I hope. Do you mean to tell me you know nothing of your uncle's business? Does nobody ever call here day or night?" Mary looked at him straight in the eyes. "I've never seen anyone," she said. "Have you ever looked into that barred room before today?" "No, never in my life. Have you any idea why he should keep it locked up?" "No, none at all." "Have you ever heard what wheels in the yard by night?" "I'm a very heavy sleeper. Nothing ever wakes me." "Where does your uncle go when he's away from home?" "I don't know." "Do you think yourself it's very peculiar to keep an inn on the King's Highway, and then bolt and bar your house to every passer-by?" "My uncle is a very peculiar man." "He is indeed. In fact, he's so peculiar that half the people in the countryside won't sleep easy in their beds until he's been hanged, like his father before him. You can tell him that from me." "I will, Mr. Bassett." "Aren't you afraid, living up here without sound or sight of a neighbor, and only this half-crazy woman for companion?" "The time passes." "You've got a close tongue, haven't you, young woman? Well, I don't envy you your relatives. I'd rather see any daughter of mine in her grave than living at Jamaica Inn with a man like Joss Merlin." He turned away and climbed onto his horse, gathering the reins in his hands. "One other thing," he called from the saddle. "Have you seen anything of your uncle's younger brother, Jim Merlin, of Trewartha?" "No," said Mary steadily. "He never comes here." "Oh, he doesn't? Well, that's all I want from you this morning. Good day to you both." And away they clattered from the yard, and so down the road to the brow of the further hill. Aunt Patience had already preceded Mary to the kitchen, and was sitting on a chair in a state of collapse. "Oh, pull yourself together," said Mary wearily. "Mr. Bassett has gone, none the wiser for his visit, and as cross as two sticks because of it. If he'd found the room reeking of brandy, there would be something to cry about. As it is, you and your Uncle Joss have scraped out of it very well." She poured herself a tumbler of water and drank it at one breath. Mary was in a fair way to losing her temper. She had lied to save her uncle's skin, when every inch of her longed to proclaim his guilt. She had looked into the barred room, and its emptiness had hardly surprised her when she remembered the visitation of the wagons a few nights back. But to have been faced with that loathsome length of rope, which she recognized immediately as the one she had seen hanging from the beam, was almost more than she could bear. And because of her aunt she had to stand still and say nothing. She was committed now, and there was no going back. For better or for worse, she had become one of the company at Jamaica Inn. As she drank down her second glass of water, she reflected, cynically, that in the end she would probably hang beside her uncle. Not only had she lied to save him, she thought with rising anger, but she had lied to help his brother Jim. Jim Merlin owed her thanks as well. Why had she lied about him, she did not know. He would probably never find out anyway, and if he did, he would take it for granted. Aunt Patience was still moaning and whimpering before the fire, and Mary was in no mood to comfort her. She felt she had done enough for her family for one day, and her nerves were on edge with the whole business. If she stayed in the kitchen a moment longer, she would scream with irritation. She went back to the wash-tub in the patch garden by the chicken run and plunged her hand savagely into the gray soapy water that was now stone cold. Joss Merlin returned just before noon. Mary heard him step into the kitchen from the front of the house, and he was met at once with a babble of words from his wife. Mary stayed where she was by the wash-tub, and she was determined to let Aunt Patience explain things in her own way, and if he called to her for confirmation, there was time enough to go indoors. She could hear nothing of what passed between them, but the voice of her aunt sounded shrill and high, and now and again her uncle interposed a question sharply. In a little while he beckoned Mary from the window, and she went inside. He was standing on the hearth, his legs straddled wide, and his face as black as thunder. "Come on," he shouted. "Out with it. What's your side of the story? I get nothing but a string of words from your aunt. A magpie makes more sense than she. What in H has been going on here? That's what I want to know." Mary told him calmly, and a few well-chosen words, what had taken place during the morning. She omitted nothing except the squire's question about his brother, and ended with Mr. Bassat's own words that people would not sleep easy in their beds until Joss Merlin was hanged, like his brother before him. The landlord listened in silence, and when she had finished, he crashed his fist down on the kitchen table and swore, kicking one of the chairs to the side of the room. "The darned skulking," he roared. "He had no more right to walk into my house than any other man. His talk of a magistrate's warrant is all bluff, you blithering fools. There's no such thing. By God, if I'd been here, I'd have sent him back to North Hill, so as his own wife would never recognize him, and if she did, she'd have no use for him again. Blast his eyes, I'll teach Mr. Bassat who's got the run of this country, and have him stuffing around my legs once more. Scared you, did he? I'll burn his house around his ears if he plays his tricks again." Joss Merlin shouted at the top of his voice, and his noise was deafening. Mary did not fear him like this. The whole thing was bluster and show. It was when he lowered his voice and whispered that she knew him to be deadly. For all his thunder, he was frightened. She could see that, and his confidence was rudely shaken. "Give me something to eat," he said. "I must go out again, and there's no time to lose. Stop that yawning, Patience, or I'll smash your face in. You've done well today, Mary, and I'll not forget it." His niece looked him in the eyes. "You don't think I did it for you, do you?" she said. "I don't care a darn why you did it. The result's the same," he answered. "Not that a blind fool like Bassat would fight anything anyway. He was born with his head in the wrong place. Cut me a hunk of bread and quit talking, and sit down at the bottom of the table where you all ought to be." The two women took their seats in silence, and the meal passed without further disturbance. As soon as he had finished, the landlord rose to his feet, and without another word to either of them, made his way to the stable. Mary expected to hear him lead his pony out once more and ride it off down the road, but in a minute or two he was back again, and passing through the kitchen he went to the end of the garden and climbed the stile to the field. Mary watched him strike across the moor and ascend the steep incline that led to Tolborough and Tor and Cotta. For a moment she hesitated, debating the wisdom of the sudden plan in her head, and the sound of her aunt's footsteps overheard, appearing to decide her. She waited until she heard the door of the bedroom close, and then, throwing off her apron and seizing her thick shawl from its peg on the wall, she ran down the field after her uncle. When she reached the bottom, she crouched beside the stone wall until his figure crossed the skyline and disappeared, and then she leapt up again and followed in his track, picking her way among the rough grass and stones. It was a mad and senseless venture, no doubt, but her mood was a reckless one, and she needed an outlet for it after her silence in the morning. Her idea was to keep Joss Merlin in view, remaining of course unseen, and in this way, perhaps, she would learn something of his secret mission. She had no doubt that the squire's visit to Jamaica had altered the landlord's plans, and that his sudden departure on foot across the heart of the West Moor was connected with it. It was not yet 1:30, and an ideal afternoon for walking. Mary, with her stout shoes and her short skirt to her ankles cared little for the rough ground. It was dry enough underfoot, the frost had hardened the surface, and accustomed as she was to the wet shingle of the Halford shore and the thick mud of the farmyard, this scramble over the moor seemed easy enough. Her earlier rambles had taught her some wisdom, and she kept to the high ground as much as possible, following as best she could the tracks taken by her uncle. Her task was a difficult one, and after a few miles she began to realize it. She was forced to keep a good light between them in order to remain unseen, and the landlord walked at such a pace and took such tremendous strides that before long Mary saw that she would be left behind. Cota Tor was past, and he turned now towards the low ground at the foot of Brown Willie, looking for all his height like a black dot against the brown stretch of the moor. The prospect of climbing some 1,300 feet came as something of a shock to Mary, and she paused for a moment and wiped her steaming face. She let down her hair for greater comfort and let it blow about her face. Why the landlord of Jamaica Inn thought it necessary to climb the highest point in Bodmin Moor on a December afternoon she could not tell, but having come so far she was determined to have some satisfaction for her pains, and she set off again at a sharper pace. The ground was now soggy beneath her feet, for here the early frost had thawed and turned to water, and the whole of the low-lying plain before her was soft and yellow from the winter rains. The damp oozed into her shoes with cold and clammy certainty, and the hem of her skirt was bespattered with bog and torn in places. Lifting it higher and hitching it round her waist with the ribbon from her hair, Mary plunged on in trail of her uncle, but she had already traversed the worst of the low ground with uncanny quickness born of long custom, and she could just make out his figure among the black heather and the great boulders at the foot of Brown Willie. Then he was hidden by a jutting crag of granite, and she saw him no more. It was impossible to discover the path he had taken across the bog. He had been over and gone in a flash, and Mary followed as best she could, floundering at every step. She was a fool to attempt it, she knew that, but a sort of stubborn stupidity made her continue, ignorant of the whereabouts of the tracks that had carried her uncle dry-shod over a bog. Mary had sense enough to make a wide circuit to avoid the treacherous ground, and by going quite 2 miles in the wrong direction she was able to cross in comparative safety. She was now hopelessly left without a prospect of ever finding her uncle again. Nevertheless, she set herself to climb Brown Willie, slipping and stumbling among the wet moss and stones, scrambling up the great peaks of jagged granite that frustrated her at every turn, while now and again a hill sheep, startled by the sound of her, ran out from behind a boulder to gaze at her and stamp his feet. Clouds were bearing up from the west, casting changing shadows on the plains beneath, and the sun went in behind them. It was very silent on the hills. Once a raven rose up at her feet and screamed. He went away, flapping his great black wings, swooping to the earth below with harsh protesting cries. When Mary reached the summit of the hill, the evening clouds were banked high above her head, and the world was gray. The distant horizon was blotted out in the gathering dusk, and the thin white mist rose from the moors beneath. Approaching the Tor from its steepest and most difficult side, as she had done, she twisted nearly an hour out on her time, and darkness would soon be upon her. Her escapade had been to little purpose, for as far as her eyes could see there was no living thing within her range. Joss Merlin had long vanished, and for all she knew he might not have climbed the Tor at all, but skirted its base along the rough heather and the smaller stones, and then made his way alone and unobserved, east or west as his business took him, to be swallowed up in the folds of the further hills. Mary would never find him now. The best course was to descend the Tor by the shortest way possible, and in the speediest fashion, otherwise she would be faced with the prospect of a winter's night upon the moors, the dead black heather for a pillow, and no other shelter but frowning crags of granite. She knew herself now for a fool to have ventured so far on a December afternoon, for experience that proved to her there were no long twilights on Bodmin Moor. When darkness came, it was swift and sudden, without warning, and an immediate blotting out of the sun. The mists were dangerous, too, rising in a cloud from the damp ground and closing in about the marshes like a white barrier. Discouraged and depressed, and all excitement gone from her, Mary scrambled down to the steep face of the Tor, one eye on the marshes below and the other for the darkness that threatened to overtake her. Directly below her there was a pool or well, said to be the source of the river Fowey. It ran ultimately to the sea, and this must be avoided at all costs, for the ground around was boggy and treacherous, and the well itself at an unknown depth. She bore to her left to avoid it, but by the time she had reached the level of the plain below, with brown Willie safely descended and lifting his mighty head in lonely splendor behind her, the mist and the darkness had settled on the moors, and the sense of direction was now lost to her. Whatever happened, she must keep her head, and not give way to a growing sense of panic. Apart from the mist, the evening was fine and not too cold, and there was no reason why she should not hit upon some track that would lead ultimately to habitation. There was no danger for the marshes if she kept to high ground, so trussing up her skirt again and wrapping her shawl firmly around her shoulders, Mary walked steadily before her, feeling the ground with some care, and then, in doubt, and avoiding those tufts of grass that felt so soft and yielding to her feet. Then the direction she was taking was unknown to her. It's obvious in the first few miles, for her way was barred suddenly by a stream that she had not passed in the outward journey. To travel by its side would lead her more to the low-lying ground and the marshes, so she plunged through it recklessly, soaking herself above the knee. Wet shoes and stockings did not worry her. She counted herself fortunate that the stream had not been deeper, which would have meant swimming for it, and chilled body to the bargain. The ground now seemed to rise in front of her, which was all to the good, as the going was firm, and she struck boldly across the high downland for what seemed an interminable distance, coming at length to the rough track bearing ahead and slightly to the right. This at any rate served for a cart's wheels at a time or other, when a cart would go where Mary could follow. The worst part was, now that her real anxiety had gone, she felt weak and desperately tired. Her limbs were heavy, dragging things that scarcely belonged to her, and her eyes felt sunken way back in her head. She plodded on, her chin low and her hands at her side, thinking that the tall gray chimneys of Jamaica Inn would be, for the first time perhaps in their existence, a welcome and consoling sight. The track broadened now, and was crossed and turned by running left and right, and Mary stood uncertainly for a few moments, wondering which to take. It was then that she heard the sound of a horse blowing as though he had been ridden hard, coming out of the darkness to the left of her. His hoofs made a dull thudding sound on the turf. Mary waited in the middle of the track, her nerves a-jingle at the suddenness of the approach, and presently the horse appeared out of the mist in front of her, a rider on his back, a pair of ghostly figures, lacking reality in the dim light. The horseman swerved as he saw Mary, and pulled up his horse to avoid her. "Hello," he cried, "who's there? And is anyone in trouble?" He peered down at her from his saddle and exclaimed in surprise, "A woman!" he said. "What in the world are you doing out here?" Mary seized hold of his rein and quieted the restive horse. "Can you put me on the road?" she said. "I'm miles from home and hopelessly lost. Steady there," he said to the horse. "Stand still, will you? Where have you come from?" "Of course I will help you if you can." His voice was low and gentle, and Mary could see he must be a person of quality. "I live at Jamaica Inn," she said, and no sooner were the words out of her mouth than she regretted them. He would not help her now, of course. The very name was enough to make him whip his horse and leave her to find her own way as best she could. She was a fool to have spoken. For a moment the man was silent, which was only what she expected, but when he spoke again, his voice had not changed, but was quiet and gentle as before. "Jamaica Inn," he said. "You've come a long way out of your road, I'm afraid. You must have been walking in the opposite direction. You're the other side of Hendra Downs here, you know." "That means nothing to me," she told him. "I've never been this way before. It was very stupid of me to venture so far on a winter's afternoon. I'd be grateful if you could show me the right path, and once on a high road, it won't take me long to get home." He considered her for a moment, and then he swung himself off the saddle to the ground. "You're exhausted," he said. "You aren't fit to walk another step, and what's more, I'm not going to let you. You're not far from the village, and you shall ride there. Will you give me your foot, and I'll help you to mount?" In a minute she was up in the saddle, and he stood below her, like the bridle in his hand. "That's better, isn't it?" he said. "You must have had a long and uncomfortable walk on the moors. Your shoes are soaking wet, and so is the hem of your gown. You shall come home with me, and dry those things and rest a while, and have some supper before I take you back, myself, to Jamaica Inn." He spoke with such solicitude, and yet with such calm authority, that Mary sighed with relief, throwing all responsibility aside for the time being, content to thrust herself in his keeping. He arranged the reins to her satisfaction, and looking up at her, she saw his eyes for the first time beneath the brim of his hat. They were strange eyes, transparent like glass, and so pale in color that they seemed near to white. A freak of nature she had never known before, they fastened upon her, and searched her, as though her very thoughts could not be hidden, and Mary herself felt herself relax before him and give way, and she did not mind. His hair was white, too, under his black shovel hat, and Mary stared back at him in some perplexity, for his face was unlined and his voice was not that of an elderly man. Then, with a little rush of embarrassment, she understood the reason for his abnormality, and she turned away her eyes. He was an albino. He took off his hat and bared his head before her. "Perhaps I had better introduce myself," he said, with a smile. "However unconventional the meeting is, I believe the usual thing to do. My name is Francis Davy, and I am the vicar of Alternon." 7. There was something strangely peaceful about the house, something very rare and difficult to define. It was like a house in an old tale, discovered by the hero one evening in midsummer. There should be a barrier of thorns about it, through which he must cut his way with a knife, and then a galaxy of flowers, growing in profusion with monstrous blooms, untended by human hand. Giant ferns would mass themselves beneath the windows, and white lilies on tall stems. In the tail there would be strands of ivy clustering the walls, barring the entrance, and on the house itself it would have slept for 1,000 years. Mary smiled at her fancy and spread her hands more to the log fire. The silence was pleasing to her. It soothed her weariness and took away her fear. This was a different world from Jamaica, and there the silence was oppressive and heavy with malice. The disused rooms stank of neglect. Here it was different. The room in which she was sitting had the quiet impersonality of a drawing room visited by the night. The furniture, the table in the center, the pictures on the walls, were without that look of solid familiarity belonging to the day. They were like sleeping things, stumbled upon at midnight by surprise. People had lived here once, happy, placid people, old rectors with musty books beneath their arms, and there by the window a gray-haired woman in a blue gown had stooped to thread her needle. That was all very long ago. They slept now in the churchyard beyond the gate, their names indecipherable on the lichened stone. Since they had gone, the house had withdrawn into itself and become silent. The man who lived there now had suffered the personality of those who had gone before to remain unchanged. Mary watched him as he laid his table for supper, and she thought how wisely he had allowed himself to become submerged in the atmosphere of the house, for another man would have chatted perhaps or made some clatter in those cups, feeling the silence a constraint. Her eyes wandered about the room, and she accepted without question the walls bare of the usual biblical themes, the polished desk empty of papers and books that in her mind were associated with the living room of a rectory. Standing in the corner was an easel, and on it a half-finished canvas of the pool of Dulsmere. It had been painted on a gray day, with the rain clouds overhead, and the water lacked all brilliance and was slate-colored, without wind. The scene held Mary's eyes and fascinated her. She knew nothing of painting, but the picture had power, and she could almost feel the rain on her face. He must have watched the direction of her eyes, and he went to the easel and turned the painting with his back towards her. "Don't look at that," he said. "It was done in a hurry, and I had no time to finish it. If you like pictures, you shall see something better. But first of all, I'm going to give you your supper. Don't move from a chair. I'll bring the table to you." It was a novelty to be waited upon. But he did it so quietly and made such little show that it seemed a natural everyday occurrence, and Mary was without embarrassment. "Hannah lives in the village," he said. "She leaves every afternoon at 4. I prefer to be by myself. I like getting my own supper, and then I can choose my own time. Luckily, she made apple tart today. I hope you can eat it. Her pastry is only moderate." He poured her out a steaming cup of tea, heaping it into a spoonful of cream. She could not yet accustom herself to his white hair and his eyes. They were such a direct contrast to his voice, and his black clerical dress made them the more remarkable. She was still tired and still strange to her surroundings, and he respected her desire for silence. Mary swallowed her supper, and now and again she stole a look at him from behind her cup of tea, but he seemed to sense her glance at once, for he would turn his eyes upon her with their cold white stare, like the impersonal and impenetrating stare of a blind man, and she would look away again over her shoulder to the lime-green walls of the room, or to the easel in the corner. "It was a providential that I should come upon you in the moor tonight," he said at length, when she had pushed away her plate and sunk once more into the chair, her chin in her hand. The warmth of the room and the hot tea made her drowsy, and his gentle voice came to her from far away. "My work sometimes takes me to the outlying cottages and farms," he continued. "This afternoon I helped to bring a child into the world. It will live, and the mother too. They are hardy and care for nothing, these people on the moors. You may have noticed that for yourself. I have a great respect for them." Mary had nothing to say in reply. The company who came to Jamaica Inn had not impressed her with respect. She wondered what the scent of roses that filled the air, and then she noticed for the first time the bowl of dried petals on the small table behind her chair. Then he spoke again, his voice gentle as ever, but with a new insistence. "Why did you wander on the moor tonight?" he said. Mary roused herself and looked into his eyes. They stared down at her in infinite compassion, and she longed to trespass on their mercy. Scarcely aware of how it happened, she heard her voice reply to his. "I'm in terrible trouble," she said. "Sometimes I think I shall become like my aunt, and go out of my mind. You may have heard rumors down here in Alternoon, and you will have shrugged your shoulders and not listened to them. I've not been at Jamaica Inn much over a month, but it seems like 20 years. It's my aunt that worries me. If only I could get her away. But she won't leave Uncle Joss for all his treatment of her. Every night I go to bed wondering if I shall wake up and hear the wagons. The first time they came there were 6 or 7 of them, and they brought great parcels and boxes that the men stored in the barred room at the end of the passage. The man was killed that night. I saw the rope hanging from the beam downstairs," she broke off, the warm color flooding her face. "I've never told anyone before," she said. "It had to come out. I couldn't keep it to myself any longer. I shouldn't have said it. I've done something terrible." For a little while he did not answer. He let her take her time, and then when she recovered herself, he spoke gently and slowly, like a father who reassures a frightened child. "Don't be afraid," he said. "Your secret is safe. No one shall know of this but me. You're very tired, you know, and this is all my fault for bringing you into the warm room and making you eat. I ought to have put you to bed. You must have been on the moor for hours, and there are bad places between here and Jamaica. The bogs are at their worst at this time of the year. When you are rested, I'll take you back in the trap, and I'll make your excuses myself to the landlord if you wish." "Oh, you mustn't do that," said Mary quickly. "If he suspects half of what I've done tonight, he would kill me, and you too. You don't understand. He's a desperate man, and he'd stop at nothing. No, if worst comes to worst, I'll try and climb up the porch to my bedroom window and get in that way. He must never know how I've been here, or that I met you even." "Isn't your imagination running away with you a little?" said the vicar. "I know I must have seemed unsympathetic and cold, but this is the 19th century, you know, and men don't murder one another without reason. I believe I have as much right to drive you on the king's highway as your uncle himself. Having gone so far, don't you think you had better let me hear the rest of your story? And what is your name, and how long have you been living at Jamaica Inn?" Mary looked up at the pale eyes and the colorless face, the halo of cropped white hair, and she thought again how strange a freak of nature was this man, who might be 21, who might be 60, and who with his soft, persuasive voice could compel her to admit every secret her heart possessed, and had he the mind to ask her. She could trust him, that at least was certain. Still she hesitated, turning the words over in her mind. "Come," he said with a smile. "I have heard confession in my time, not here in Alternoon, but in Ireland and in Spain. Your story will not sound as strange to me as you think. There are other worlds besides Jamaica Inn." His speech made her feel humble and a little confused. It was as though he mocked her for all his tact and kindness, and supposed her in the back of his mind to be hysterical and young. She plunged headlong into her story with jerky, ill-framed sentences, beginning with that first Saturday night in the bar, and then working backwards to her arrival at the inn. Her tale sounded flat and unconvincing even to herself who knew the truth of it, and her great fatigue made her labor in the telling of it so that she was continually at a loss for words, and she kept pausing for reflection and then going back on her story and repeating herself. He heard her to the end with patience, without comment or question, but all the while she felt his white eyes watching her, and he had a little trick of swallowing at intervals which she came instinctively to recognize and wait for. The fear she had sustained, the agony and the doubt, sounded to her ears as she listened like the worked-up invention of an overstimulated mind, and the conversation in the bar between her uncle and the stranger had developed into an elaborate piece of nonsense. She sensed, rather than saw, the vicar's unbelief, and in a desperate attempt to tone down her now ridiculous and highly colored story, her uncle, who had been the villain of it, became the usual hard-drinking bully of a countryman who beat his wife once a week, and the wagons themselves had no more menace than the carrier's carts traveling by night to expedite delivery. The visit of the squire of North Hill early that day had some conviction, but the empty room struck another note of anticlimax, and the only part of the story that rang with any sense of reality was Mary's losing herself on the moors during the afternoon. When she had finished, the vicar got up from his chair and began to pace about the room. He whistled softly under his breath and kept playing with a loose button on his coat that was hanging by a thread. Then he came to a standstill on the hearth, with his back to the fire, and looked down upon her, but Mary could read nothing from his eyes. "I believe you, of course," he said after a moment or so. "You haven't the face of a liar, and I doubt if you know the meaning of hysteria, but your story wouldn't go in court of law. Not as you've told it tonight, anyhow. It's too much of a fairy tale, and another thing, it's a scandal and an outrage, we all know that, but smuggling is rife all over the country, and half the magistrates do very well out of it. That shocks you, doesn't it? But I can assure you it's the truth. If the law was stricter, there would be greater supervision, and your uncle's little nest in Jamaica Inn would have been blotted out long ago. I have met Mr. Bassat once or twice, and I believe him to be an honest, genuine sort of fellow, but between ourselves, a bit of a fool. He'd bluster and talk, but that's about all. He'll keep his morning's expedition very quiet, unless I'm much mistaken. Actually, he had no business to walk into the inn and search the rooms, and if it becomes known that he did so and found nothing for his pains, he'll become the laughing-stock of the countryside. I can tell you one thing, though, his visit will have scared your uncle, and he'll lie low for a time. There won't be any more wagons to Jamaica Inn for some while. I think you can be certain of that." Mary listened to the reasoning with some misgiving. She had hoped he would be appalled, once admitting the truth of her story, but there he was, apparently quite unmoved, taking it all as a matter of course. He must have seen the disappointment in her face, for he spoke again. "I could see Mr. Bassat if you like," he said, "and put your story to him, but unless he can watch your uncle at work, as it were, and the wagons in the yard, there's little chance of convicting him. That's what I must impress upon your mind. I'm afraid I sound very unhelpful, but the position is difficult from every point of view, and then again, you don't want your aunt to be implicated in the business, and I don't see how it can be avoided if it comes to arrest." "What do you suggest I do, then?" said Mary helplessly. "If I were you, I should play a waiting game," he replied. "Keep a close watch on your uncle, and when the wagons do come again, and you can report at once to me, we can then decide together what's best to be done, that is, if you will honor me again with your confidence." "What about the stranger who disappeared?" said Mary. "He was murdered, I'm certain of that. Do you mean to say nothing can ever be done about it?" "I'm afraid not, unless his body is found, which is extremely unlikely," said the vicar. "It is quite possible that he was never killed at all, for that matter. Forgive me, but I think you allowed your imagination to run away with you over that. All you saw was a piece of rope, remember? If you had actually seen the man dead or even wounded, well, that's a different tale altogether." "I heard my uncle threaten him," persisted Mary. "Isn't that enough?" "My dear child, people threaten one another every day of the year, but they don't hang for it. Now listen to me. I am your friend, and you can trust me. If you ever become worried or distressed in any way, I want you to come and tell me about it. You are not afraid of walking, judging by your performance this afternoon, and Alternoon is only a few miles from the high road. If you come at any time and I'm not in, Hannah will be here. and she will look after you. Now that's a bargain between us, isn't it? Thank you very much. Now put on your stockings again and your shoes while I go to the stable and get the trap. I'm going to drive you back to Jamaica Inn." The thought of returning was hateful to Mary, but it had to be faced. The contrast between this peaceful room with the gently shaded candles, the warm log fire, the deep chair, and the cold grim passages of Jamaica Inn with their own little cupboard and a room over the porch must be avoided at all costs. There was one thing to bear in mind, and that was that she could come back here when she wished. The night was fine. The dark clouds of the early evening had passed away, and the sky was ablaze with stars. Mary sat beside Francis Davy on the high seat of the dog-cart, wrapped in a great coat with a top collar of velvet. This was not the same horse that he had been riding when she met him on the moor. This was a big grey cob, who, fresh from his sojourn at the stable, went like the wind. It was a strange, exhilarating drive. The wind blew in Mary's face, stinging her eyes. The climb from Alternoon had been slow at first, for the hill was steep, but now they were high upon the road, with their faces turned to Baldwin. The vicar picked up the cob with his whip, so that he laid his ears flat to his head and galloped like a mad thing. His hoofs thundered on the white road, raising a cloud of dust, and Mary was flung against her companion. He made no effort to rein in his horse, and glancing up at him, Mary saw that he was smiling. "Go on," he said, "go on, you can go faster than this." And his voice was low and excited, as though he were talking to himself. The effect was unnatural, a little startling, and Mary was aware of a feeling of discomfiture, as though he had betaken himself to another world and had forgotten her existence. Seated where she was, she could observe him for the first time in profile, and she saw how clear-cut were his features, how prominent the thin nose. Perhaps it was the peculiarity of nature, creating him white in the beginning, that made him different from any man she had ever seen before. He looked like a bird, crouched in his seat with his black cape coat blown out by the wind. His arms were like wings. He might be any age, and she could not place him at all. Then he smiled down at her, and was human again. "I love these moors," he said. "You have had a bad introduction to them, of course, so you can't understand me. If you knew them as well as I do, and had seen them in every mood, winter and summer, you would love them too. They have a fascination unlike other part of the country. They go back a long way in time. Sometimes I think they are survival of another age. The moors were the first things to be created. Afterwards came the forests, the valleys, and the sea. Climb Roughdure one morning before sunrise, and listen to the wind in the stones. You'll know what I mean then." Mary kept thinking of the parson at her home. He was a cheerful little man with a little string of children exactly like himself, and his wife made damson cheese. Okay, my nuke just died, so I have to plug it in and charge it. But that's okay, I can do that. Charging the nuke. Music. I'm just going to give it a few minutes before I walk over to it and go back to reading it. I wish my nose would stop getting so stuffy. Okay. Mm-hmm. He preached the same sermon always on Christmas Day, and his parishioners could have prompted him anywhere. She wondered what Francis Davies said in his church at Alternan. Did he preach about Rufter, the light on Dozemary Pool? They had come to the dip in the road now, where a cluster of trees made a little valley for the river Fowey, and in front of them stretched the climb to the high, unsheltered ground. Already Mary could see the tall chimneys of Jamaica Inn outlined against the sky. The drive was ended, and the exhilaration went from her. The old dread and loathing from her uncle returned. The vicar stopped his horse just short of the yard, under the lee of the grass bank. "There's no sign of anyone," he said quietly. "It's like a house of the dead. Would you like me to try the door?" Mary shook her head. "It's bolted always," she whispered, "and the windows are barred. That's my room, over the porch. I can scramble up there if you will let me climb on your shoulder. I've managed worse places than that at home. My window is open at the top. Once on the porch it'll be easy enough." "You'll slip on those slates," he answered. "I won't let you do it. It's absurd. Is there no other way of getting in? What about the back?" "The door on the bar will be bolted, and the kitchen too," said Mary. "We can slip round if you'd like, and make certain." She led the way round to the other side of the house, and then she turned to him. Suddenly, her finger to her lips. "There's a light in the kitchen," she whispered. "That means my uncle is there. Aunt Patience always goes early. There's no curtains to the window. If we pass by, he will see us." She leaned back against the wall of the house. Her companion motioned her to be still. "Very well," he said. "I will take care he does not see me. I am going to look in at the window." She watched him to the side of the window, and he stood there for a few minutes gazing into the kitchen. Then he beckoned her to follow, that same tense smile on his face that she had noticed before. His face looked very pale against his black shovel hat. "There will be no argument tonight with the landlord of Jamaica Inn," he said. Mary followed the direction of his eyes and pressed forward to the window. The kitchen was lit by a single candle stuck sideways into a bottle. It had already burned down halfway, and great blobs of grease clung to the side of it. The flame itself wavered and sputtered in the draught from the door, which was wide open in the garden. Joss Merlin sprawled at the table in a drunken stupor, his great legs stretched out on either side of him, his hat on the back of his head. He stared before him at the guttering candle, his eyes glazed and fixed like a dead man. Another bottle lay with its neck smashed on the table, and beside it an empty glass. The peat fire had smoldered itself to nothing. Francis Davy pointed to the open door. "You can walk inside and go upstairs to bed," he said. "Your uncle will not even see you. Fasten the door after you, and blow out the candle. You don't want a fire on your hands. Good night to you, Mary Ellen. If you are ever in trouble and need me, I shall be waiting for you at Alternan." Then he turned the corner of the house and was gone. Mary tiptoed into the kitchen and closed and fastened the door. She could have slammed it if she had wished. It would not have roused her uncle. He had gone to his kingdom of heaven, and the little world was lost to him. She blew out the light beside him and left him alone in the darkness. Wait. I feel like I should stop here. Um, because we have 10 chapters left, and I don't know if the battery will actually charge very well. if I don't give the nuke a rest. So I think here I'm just going to end the stream and come back later for part 2. So we'll read from chapter 8 to the rest of the book, because the last chapter is chapter 18, so that would be 10 chapters left of the book, which is almost half of the book. Anyway, thank you for listening so far. I will read more when it is finished charging. Thank you. Thank you for listening. Goodbye for now.